So you have found your way here. Good. The lights are probably low or maybe off completely. The room has settled into that particular quiet that only arrives late at night, when the outside world has gone still and all that remains is the gentle hum of whatever is keeping you comfortable. A fan, maybe. The sound of a television from another room, too muffled to make out. The rhythm of your own breathing, slowly finding its pace. And you have decided, of all the ways you could be spending this particular quiet, to spend it thinking about one of the strangest and most unexpectedly rich animated programs that has ever aired on network television. Family Guy, a show that has been running since 1999, a show that got canceled twice and came back from the dead both times, a show that has always sat in a strange middle territory between beloved and mocked, between brilliant and lazy, between genuinely moving and deliberately offensive, between the kind of entertainment people love without apology and the kind they feel they have to defend when they admit to watching it. A show, most importantly for our purposes tonight, that has inspired some of the most elaborate and genuinely interesting fan theories ever constructed around any piece of popular media. That is what we are here for. Not the debates about quality, not the rankings of seasons or the arguments about which era of the show is worth watching, not even the characters themselves in any analytical sense. We are here for the theories, the quiet, strange, sometimes darkly beautiful ideas that people have built in the spaces between what the show shows you and what it leaves out, the explanations that nobody officially asked for but that, once you have heard them, have a way of settling into your thinking and refusing to leave. So pull the blanket up a little, let your eyes do whatever they want to do, and let us begin with the theory that, for many people who have spent serious time in Family Guy fan communities, is the one that changes everything. The family at the center of all of this is not, by any ordinary measure, a likable one. They have done things, across 20-plus seasons of television, that would disqualify most fictional families from audience sympathy. The father has been cruel in ways that exceed comedy. The mother has made choices that the early version of herself would not have made. The children have been failed in ways that the show has occasionally acknowledged and then declined to act on. The dog has been a disappointment to himself more often than to anyone else. And yet, the theories that people have built around them are acts of love, unmistakably. The care that goes into trying to understand why Peter is the way he is, what Brian is actually carrying, what Stewie knows that nobody around him knows, what Meg's existence means within the structure of the family. This care is not the care you extend to something you have given up on. It is the care you extend to something you refuse to give up on. The refusal is the point. The refusal is what the theories are made of. So that is where we are starting tonight, in the space of that refusal, in the company of people who looked at a flawed, beloved, endlessly complicated animated comedy and decided that it was worth the effort of understanding more completely than it understood itself. The room is quiet. The hour is late. You are here. Let us begin. Section 1. The world is wrong. Peter's heightened reality and the theory that rewrites the whole show. There is a question that lives underneath every episode of Family Guy. Below the cutaway gags and the celebrity cameos and the recurring jokes and the seasonal music. It is not a question anybody asks out loud while they are watching, because the act of watching a television show requires a certain suspension of the question. You agree, implicitly, to let things go. To not push too hard on the logic. To accept the world as presented and trust that things are approximately the way they appear. But the question is there anyway, if you go looking for it. Why does any of this make sense? Family Guy is not alone in having this problem. Most long-running animated comedies share the basic logical impossibility that their characters do not age, that catastrophic events have no lasting consequences, that the same baseline reality resets between episodes regardless of what happened in the last one. The Simpsons shares this. Bob's Burgers shares this. South Park has built elaborate systems to explain it, and then regularly abandons those systems. This is the nature of the format. But Family Guy, when you sit with it long enough, generates this question with a particular insistence. Because the world of Family Guy is strange in ways that go beyond the ordinary cartoon logic of consequence-free existence. The strangeness has a specific texture, a distinct flavor. Characters survive things they genuinely should not survive. The same family has experienced more large-scale catastrophes in a fictional Rhode Island suburb than most real-world disaster zones. Peter Griffin can lose his job, crash a vehicle, accidentally set fire to a significant portion of the neighborhood, physically harm his own children in ways that would constitute felonies in any jurisdiction, and by the following episode, everyone is fine and nothing has changed, and the kitchen looks exactly as it did before Peter drove through the wall. The world bends around Peter specifically. It is almost deferential to him. And then there are the cutaway gags, the random intrusions of unrelated scenes. The way the show will be in the middle of telling one story and then abruptly deposit you inside a completely different scenario for 30 seconds before pulling you back out, with no explanation, no acknowledgement, as though this is simply how narrative works. Memory without context. Association without any discernible logic. A character says something that rhymes, loosely, with the title of a film from 1983, and suddenly we are watching a completely unrelated scene that has nothing to do with anything that has happened in the episode. Then we are back. The story continues. The question underneath all of this, the one that does not go away if you are the kind of person who goes looking for it, is, why is the world arranged this way? What is the internal logic that makes all of this strangeness feel like it is pointing at something rather than nothing? The theory that emerged from a now-deleted Reddit account, preserved and discussed and expanded upon across countless fan communities in the years since its original posting, provides an answer that is as complete as any fan theory can be. The world of Family Guy is the way it is because it is not reality. It is a constructed space, a psychological interior, a world that exists inside the fractured, grieving, desperately creative mind of a man named Peter Griffin, who is sitting alone somewhere in a care facility in Rhode Island, imagining a version of the life he lost, and imagining it with a completeness and a consistency that his injured mind can sustain, but not quite perfect. Here is the story the theory tells, and it deserves to be taken slowly, because the details of it carry weight. Before the show begins, before the pilot episode, before any of it, there was a real Griffin family living in a real house in Rhode Island. Peter was there, and Lois was there, and their children were there. Meg was the oldest, a teenager. Chris was younger, awkward, still figuring out who he was. Lois was pregnant with another child, the third, who had not yet been born. One night, Meg and Chris went to a party. A school party. The kind that teenagers attend and parents worry about in that low-level, persistent way that rarely crosses into actual intervention. Meg was driving. She had been drinking. On the way home, the car went off the road. Both of them died. Lois received the call. And Lois, who was pregnant and who loved her children in the fierce and comprehensive way that she did, could not absorb what had happened. She could not metabolize grief of that magnitude. The weight of it was too much. She ended her own life. She was carrying the unborn baby when she did. Stewie Griffin died before he was ever born. Peter was left alone. And Peter Griffin, who was never the most emotionally sophisticated person, but who loved his family with a totality that was perhaps the single most real thing about him, broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. He broke the way things break when the pressure has been building for a long time and finally reaches the one point that cannot hold. He was placed in care. The people around him determined that he needed to be somewhere supervised and stable, while his mind tried to find a way through what had happened to him. Peter's mind found a way through. But the way it found was not the way anyone would have predicted. His mind did not process the grief and emerge on the other side scarred but functional. His mind built a door, and it went through the door and closed it behind itself and began constructing a world in the space on the other side. The world of Family Guy. In this world, Meg is alive. She is a teenager at school, unpopular and overlooked, occasionally treated with a carelessness that nobody in the family quite examines or takes responsibility for. The show's treatment of Meg, the dismissal, the casual contempt, the way her suffering is treated as background noise rather than something requiring a genuine response, reads completely differently when you understand what she represents in Peter's constructed reality. Peter's subconscious knows what Meg did. The part of him that built this world, the deep architectural part of his mind, remembers the night she was driving, and it has smuggled that memory into her fictional existence in the form of an attitude. He does not consciously hate Meg in the fantasy. He cannot, because the conscious part of his mind loves her and is protecting her memory by keeping her alive in the first place. But the buried guilt and the buried anger have nowhere else to go, so they leak out sideways as a generalized aura of dismissal and contempt that no one in the fantasy can explain but everyone participates in. Peter's constructed family treats Meg badly because Peter's deepest self cannot forgive her, even as the rest of him would be devastated to acknowledge that. Chris exists in the fantasy as the gentle, clueless, fundamentally harmless figure he is because Peter's mind has preserved him at a particular moment. The Chris of the fantasy is not quite the Chris who died. He is the Chris that Peter remembers fondly, stripped of complexity and rendered in the primary colors of memory. He is not fully developed because the memory that generates him was never fully developed either. He existed, in Peter's actual experience of him, at the periphery of things. He was the sweet one, the goofy one, the one you did not worry about because he seemed incapable of sharp-edged self-destruction. In the fantasy, Chris is safe. He will always be safe. He will never grow up enough to be at risk of anything. Lois is the most heartbreaking figure in this framework. Because Lois, the real Lois, chose to leave. Peter's mind knows this. The deepest part of his grief is not only for the children who were taken but for the wife who chose to go. And yet his fantasy cannot bear to make her absent. So the Lois of the fantasy is there every morning when the fantasy begins. She makes breakfast. She argues with Peter. She sighs at his decisions. She loves him in the complicated, often frustrated, fundamentally genuine way that long marriages love. She is perfect in her imperfection. She is his. But the fantasy cannot sustain her without interference. Because the part of Peter's mind that remembers what she did keeps sending signals, keeps trying to assert the truth through the fiction. And over the course of the seasons, as the fantasy runs longer and longer and Peter's real-world condition perhaps deteriorates, Lois changes. She becomes harder, colder, more capable of cruelty, more willing to act in ways that the Lois of the early seasons would have refused. The real Lois, the one who left, keeps bleeding through the invented one. It is not character decline. It is the intrusion of a suppressed memory into a protective fiction. And then there is Stewie. Stewie is the child who never lived. He is what Peter imagines the unborn child could have become, given the chance. And the imagination, working in the way that grieving imaginations do when freed from the constraint of reality, made him extraordinary. Not just smart, but genius-level smart. Not just capable, but world-alteringly capable. Because the child you never got to meet can be everything. You gave up the right to know what they actually were, and in the place of that knowledge you receive the unlimited canvas of potential. Stewie is everything that child could have been. All the intelligence Peter wishes he had, all the capability, all the achievement, all of it poured into the impossible baby who builds time machines in his bedroom and speaks with a British accent and plots world domination with the sophistication of someone who has already won several wars. The detail about Stewie hating Lois, the one that defined his entire character in the first several seasons and that was so consistent and so specific, is perhaps the most exact element of the theory. Stewie does not just dislike Lois in the way a character might clash with another. He is specifically, elaborately, almost obsessively preoccupied with her destruction, the weapons pointed at her, the plans designed specifically around her removal, the relentless focus of his hostility on his mother rather than any other figure in his world. In a child who never drew breath, who died because of what Lois chose, who never had the chance to form any relationship with his mother at all, the anger at the mother who was not there to mother him makes a kind of terrible sense. Stewie hates Lois because Peter, at the deepest level, has never fully forgiven her. He could not forgive her consciously, because doing so would require acknowledging grief too enormous to hold. So, the grief, and the anger inside the grief, was given to Stewie. Let the baby carry it. He was never real anyway. He can carry things that the real self cannot. Brian is Peter's own intelligence, externalized and given a safer container. This is something that traumatized minds sometimes do locate their better capacities in a figure they can relate to from outside, so that the primary self can remain protected by its apparent limitations. Peter in the fantasy is stupid, genuinely, sometimes painfully limited. But Brian is brilliant. Brian has read the things Peter wishes he had read. Brian cares about the things Peter wishes he cared about. Brian is the person Peter might have become if circumstances had been more encouraging, if something at some early junction had tilted slightly in a different direction. The reason Brian fails at everything he attempts is that this intelligence, this better self, was always Peter's. It carries Peter's luck, and Peter's luck, in the world outside the fantasy, was very poor indeed. Cleveland and Quagmire visit Peter sometimes in the facility. They tell him things about their lives and about the neighborhood and about the people they know. Their visits are the raw material from which Peter's imagination constructs his companions in the fantasy. The real Joe Swanson, the neighbor across the street who is apparently in a wheelchair and apparently enormously admired, becomes in Peter's world the figure of everything he wishes he could have been: strong, heroic, capable, the father that Peter wishes he had managed to be. The wheelchair is there because even the most generous imagination retains some sense of the limits of wish fulfillment. Joe can be everything, but not without some limitation, some caveat, some reminder that even the ideal is not without its constraints. The cutaway gags are Peter's actual memories. This is one of the most elegant elements of the entire theory, and the one that changes the experience of watching the show most completely once you have accepted it. The fragments of unrelated content that interrupt the narrative without warning, that have nothing to do with the story and seem to come from nowhere, those are the real life pushing through. The years before the loss, the things Peter saw and heard and laughed at and loved, bubbling up through the carefully maintained fiction of the fantasy in the moments when the maintenance briefly lapses. They are not lazy writing. They are not random associations generated by chance. They are memory, surfacing unbidden, briefly visible, then gone again as the narrative closes back over them. The cutaway gags get longer and more frequent as the seasons progress, which the theory reads as the fantasy becoming less stable. The longer Peter maintains this world, the more effort is required to sustain it, and the more the real memories leak through in the gaps. By the later seasons, the boundary between the protected narrative and the unwanted memories has eroded significantly. The fantasy is still running, still doing the work of keeping Peter inside a world where his family exists, but the maintenance has visibly become more difficult. The reason this theory does not feel cruel, even though its premise is enormously dark, is that it answers the underlying question with something that is genuinely, unexpectedly kind. The world is wrong because it was never meant to be right. It was meant to be bearable, and for the man at the center of it, for Peter Griffin sitting in a hospital bed somewhere in Rhode Island, imagining his wife laughing in the kitchen and his children fighting over the television, imagining all of it with the full creative power of a mind that has put everything it has into the act of imagination, bearable is more than enough. He is not crazy. He is surviving, in the only way left to him, and the family he built to survive with, the flawed and chaotic and occasionally cruel and ultimately, stubbornly, persistently loving family of the Griffin household, exists because of how much he loved the real one. Because grief that large creates things. Because the mind, faced with a loss that cannot be accepted, will build a world in which the loss did not happen, and will sustain that world for as long as it can. For as many seasons as it takes, he keeps them alive. All of them. In the only way he has left. If you are still awake and finding this peaceful, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a perfect moment. It costs nothing, and it means more to this channel than you might expect. Section 2. Through Stewie's eyes when the entire show is one baby's innocent misperception. Let us move from the darkest theory in the collection to something considerably gentler. Where the Peter theory places the entire construction of Family Guy inside the traumatized grief of a middle-aged man who has lost everything, this one offers a very different architecture. This one is smaller, simpler, and in its own way, more fundamentally strange, because it asks you to consider that the show you have been watching, all of it, every character and every conversation and every absurd situation, is the subjective experience of a one-year-old baby who cannot yet walk reliably. The theory, which originated in a Reddit post by a user with the memorable handle iFornication, builds from a single observation that is, when you actually think about it, considerably more significant than it initially appears. Nobody can consistently hear Stewie. This is a question that has genuinely puzzled Family Guy viewers since the very first season. The inconsistency is real and documented, and has driven dedicated fans to considerable frustration. Brian always understands Stewie. He can always hear him, always responds to what he says, always engages in the elaborate conversations that constitute a significant portion of the show's runtime. Chris sometimes understands Stewie in a way the show never quite explains. Babies and small children can usually hear him. Strangers occasionally respond to things he says in ways that suggest comprehension. But Peter and Lois almost never understand him, and when they do, it is treated as exceptional rather than ordinary. The official explanation, provided by executive producer Rich Appel in an interview from 2015, is that within the family, Peter and Lois specifically cannot understand Stewie, and that outside the family, the rest of the world mostly cannot either. This is the answer the show has given when pressed. But it raises more questions than it resolves. Why would the family specifically be unable to understand their own youngest child? Why can Brian, who is a dog and who exists in the same household, always hear him? Why does the rule apply so inconsistently across episodes and seasons? The fan theory answers all of these questions simultaneously by removing the premise that generates them. Stewie is not speaking intelligible English that some characters can hear and others cannot. Stewie is not speaking at all in any meaningful linguistic sense. He is making baby noises, the gurgles and half-formed sounds that babies make as they are beginning to develop language. And the world that the audience sees and hears is not objective reality. It is Stewie's own subjective perception of his life, filtered through an infant consciousness that is only just beginning to learn what any of this means. In Stewie's perception, his own babbles and gurgles are the sophisticated, British-accented monologues that the audience hears. His imagination supplies the words that his developing vocal apparatus cannot yet produce. The elaborate plots and the sarcastic commentary and the world domination schemes are all happening inside the mind of a 1-year-old. They are real in the sense that they are genuinely his thoughts, the genuine product of his developing consciousness encountering the world for the first time. They are simply not being communicated to anyone outside him in the form the audience receives them. This resolves the hearing problem cleanly. Brian does not understand Stewie because he is mysteriously attuned to infant speech or because some other show internal explanation applies. Brian does not understand Stewie linguistically at all. What the audience sees when Brian and Stewie have a conversation is Stewie's interpretation of his interactions with the family dog. Brian barks. Brian wags his tail. Brian sniffs at Stewie and lies down near him and occasionally licks his face and simply, consistently, reliably exists in Stewie's vicinity with a kind of warm and uncritical presence that Stewie finds enormously comforting. And Stewie's infant imagination, which is doing the work of constructing meaning out of everything it encounters, interprets all of this as speech. Not just any speech, but sophisticated speech, because to Stewie, Brian is simply another member of the family, and all members of the family speak. That Brian's voice, as constructed by Stewie's imagination, is dry and witty and intellectually nuanced, is a function of how Stewie relates to the dog's presence. Brian is warm without being demanding. Brian is consistent without being authoritative. Brian does not tell Stewie no. And in the vocabulary of infant experience, an entity that provides warmth and presence and consistency without authority becomes the most important figure in the environment. Stewie's imagination has made Brian eloquent because Brian, in the register that matters most to a baby, is the adults in Stewie's life are the ones he genuinely cannot reach in any real communicative sense, which is why they cannot hear him in the fantasy version of events. Lois enforces every regulation that shapes Stewie's existence. She controls when he eats, and when he sleeps, and when he is picked up, and when he is put down, and what he is allowed to touch, and where he is allowed to go. She is a figure of authority so total that she controls Stewie's access to almost everything he encounters in the world. From an infant's point of view, before the developmental stage that allows a child to understand that the parent who says no is also the parent who loves you, this kind of authority looks very different from how it looks to an adult. It looks, to a baby, like an obstacle of enormous power, the most consistent force between Stewie and everything he wants. The fantasy of destroying Lois, which defined early Stewie with such vivid specificity, is not the product of genuine homicidal intent. It is the first and most basic version of a desire for autonomy, the desire to have some control over one's own experience. Every baby who has ever screamed in frustration when a toy was taken away, who has ever pushed back against a nap they did not want to take, who has ever reached towards something and been redirected and felt the specific outrage of being redirected, has felt some version of what Stewie is expressing. His imagination simply renders it in the most dramatic possible terms. In the real world, he cries. In his imagination, he builds a laser cannon and delivers a speech about inevitable victory. The emotional content is the same. The expression is considerably more operatic. Peter, who is enormous and loud and unpredictable in the way that large, enthusiastic adults are unpredictable to babies, appears in Stewie's imagination as a buffoon of spectacular proportions. Not because Peter is actually as limited as the show depicts him. In real life, Peter Griffin is probably a fairly ordinary working-class man who makes bad decisions with some regularity and who is not particularly reflective but who is basically functional. But from the vantage point of a baby who has not yet developed the cognitive framework for interpreting adult behavior as benign, Peter's loudness and unpredictability and general physical bigness render themselves as something close to chaos. Stewie's imagination has taken what he perceives and amplified it into the character the audience knows. Chris is a teenager, which means he exists in the specific in-between space that infants cannot quite categorize. He is not a peer and not an authority, and not a primary caregiver. He is simply present, goofy, occasionally engaging, mostly at the periphery of Stewie's attention. The imagination has rendered him accordingly, as someone goofy and peripheral and slightly confusing in the way that adolescents are confusing to people who have not yet experienced adolescence. Meg presents one of the most interesting interpretive problems within this framework, and the one that ultimately generates the most emotional resonance. Meg, who the show becomes progressively crueler toward as the seasons pass, is rendered in Stewie's imagination based on what an infant actually observes. And what Stewie observes is a teenager who fights with her parents, who raises her voice, who slams doors, who is visibly and persistently unhappy in ways that register as disharmony in the environment, even if the specific content of that unhappiness is incomprehensible to a 1-year-old. Stewie perceives the conflict. He does not understand it. He does not know about peer pressure or adolescent insecurity or the complicated emotional landscape of being a teenage girl navigating a chaotic household. All he knows is that whenever Meg is in a room, something is wrong. And so his imagination has taken that correctly perceived disharmony and rendered Meg as the member of the family that everyone is in conflict with. He has, in a sense, accurately described the emotional reality of Meg's situation in his house. He has simply misunderstood the cause. She is not despised because she deserves to be. She is the teenager who is struggling and whose struggle manifests as friction and whose friction reads, to an infant who cannot yet interpret friction sympathetically, as wrongness attached to her person. The cutaway gags within this framework are the most structurally honest element of the entire show, and they reveal themselves as such the moment you accept the theory. They are not a stylistic choice. They are not a comedy technique borrowed from sketch comedy tradition. They are the fundamental reality of infant cognition. Babies do not think in sustained linear narrative. They think in moments, in images, in associations that are triggered by sensory and emotional connections rather than causal ones. They move from one thing to another with a speed and an apparent randomness that adults find disorienting, but that has its own perfect internal logic, the logic of a mind that has not yet learned to filter its attention according to conventional relevance. When the show is in the middle of a scene and then cuts to something completely unrelated for 30 seconds before cutting back, it is showing you exactly how Stewie's mind moves. He was paying attention to this, and then something else caught his interest, and then he returned to the first thing. The cutaway gag is, at its structural level, a depiction of infant attention. It is how a baby experiences the continuous stream of the world, in perfectly ordered flashes of moment-to-moment interest. There is something beautiful in this, if you let it be beautiful. The theory converts what looked like the show's most commercially motivated formal choice, the gag format that makes clips go viral and allows individual moments to be extracted and shared without context, into something that is aesthetically and emotionally true. The cutaways are not lazy. They are accurate. They are what the inside of a baby's mind looks like, translated into 22 minutes of weekly television. As the seasons progress and Stewie changes, the theory reads that change as genuine developmental progress. The evil genius persona softens. The obsession with Lois recedes. The friendship with Brian deepens and becomes the primary relationship of the show. These shifts, which the actual production history attributes to creative decisions by writers who felt they had exhausted the evil baby premise, are read by the theory as the natural development of a child's consciousness, expanding and becoming more capable of complexity. He becomes less focused on the overwhelming presence of the caregiver and more interested in the world beyond her. He develops the capacity for real connection with Brian, because real connection with another person becomes possible as the infant consciousness matures. The show's frozen time, the fact that Stewie has been 1 year old since 1999, is the one place the theory requires you to suspend the logic slightly, but there is a way of holding it that works. The show is not depicting a child aging in real time. It is showing us a window of perception, a specific and unrepeatable developmental moment, preserved because it is the moment that was most vivid and most strange. The world as seen for the first time, everything enormous and extraordinary and unfiltered by familiarity. That window, in the show's internal logic, stays open, and we get to look through it. The evidence for this theory is not limited to abstract interpretation. It shows up in specific, observable details embedded in the show's earliest episodes. In the first season, Stewie's comprehension of language is both complete and somehow inconsistent with ordinary infant development in a direction that the theory makes legible. He understands everything that is said around him. His responses to adult conversation are immediate and sophisticated. But the things he says are not understood by the adults in the same way that the adult's speech is understood by him. The asymmetry is treated as a joke, as one of the show's basic premises, the baby who speaks in full paragraphs while the grown-ups hear only babbling. But the theory asks you to take this asymmetry at face value. An infant's auditory processing is not adult auditory processing. Infants do not experience language the way adults do. They experience a stream of sound that gradually, over the first years of life, resolves into discrete units that carry meaning. Before that resolution is complete, everything an infant hears is closer to music than to language. Rich with emotional information, saturated with tone and rhythm and the specific quality of the relationship between speaker and listener, thin on propositional content. An infant hears that its mother is pleased or frightened or frustrated or loving, hears the shape of the feeling behind the words before it hears the words. Stewie hears the world this way. What the show renders as his sophisticated internal monologue, the articulate and elaborate observations that he makes about everything happening around him, is the theory's representation of how an infant's mind actually processes incoming experience. Not as adult language, not as a stream of comprehensible propositions, but as an attempt to organize sense impression into something coherent. The elaborateness of Stewie's speech is not evidence of unusual intelligence. It is what all infant minds look like from the inside. Enormous, effortful, saturated with the attempt to make meaning out of a world that has not yet become intelligible. The adults who cannot understand Stewie are not failures of hearing or attention. They are simply not receiving his processing as language. They receive it as something pre-linguistic, as the sounds an infant makes, which is what it actually is. The joke of the show, that the baby speaks and nobody listens, is, in this reading, not a joke at all. It is a representation of the actual communication gap between an infant and the adults in its life. The gap that all infants experience. The profound isolation of having an interior life that has no channel to the exterior world yet. Brian understands Stewie. In the early seasons, the show establishes this as one of their most important differentiating details. Brian responds to Stewie in ways that suggest comprehension. He engages with Stewie's actual content rather than with the social performance of responding to a baby. The theory's explanation for this is not that Brian is unusual in his perceptual capabilities. It is that a dog's relationship with the pre-linguistic is simply different from a human adult's. Dogs process the world in ways that overlap more significantly with an infant's processing than adult human processing does. The emotional texture of communication, the thing that infants are most sensitive to, is also the thing that dogs are most sensitive to. Brian does not understand Stewie's words in the way an adult might understand them. But he understands the emotional reality behind the words, which is the part that matters to Stewie, which is why their communication succeeds in ways that communication with the human adults does not. There is a depth of loneliness in the early Stewie that the evil genius characterization can obscure. He is 1 year old, he is doing the enormous work of making sense of the world, and the people responsible for his care cannot receive what he sends them. His mother picks him up and holds him and loves him, and has no access to what he is actually experiencing. His father is a shape in the environment with a specific emotional signature, large and loud and sometimes frightening and, occasionally, in ways that are more felt than understood, warm. His siblings are presences with their own specific textures, navigated by feel rather than comprehension. And the dog is the one who comes close, who responds to the actual signal. Who lets Stewie know that being understood is possible, even here, even now, even at 1 year old in a body that cannot yet do what he needs it to do. The world domination plans, read through this lens, are the infant's response to the specific texture of helplessness. The ordinary condition of infancy, the complete dependence, the inability to control anything, the experience of being subject to the decisions of beings who are enormous relative to you and who cannot adequately receive your communication, generates something in a mind sophisticated enough to register it, not the specific ideological content of world domination, the pre-verbal template of it. The deep insistence that this will not always be the situation, that the current condition is temporary, that eventually something will change and the helplessness will end. The elaborate villain speak of Stewie's ambitions is Stewie's mind giving that pre-verbal insistence its best available form, not evil. Just a baby doing what babies do, reaching for the future where things will finally be different. The plan is always the same plan. The plan is to grow up. Section 3. The two universes problem: why pre-cancellation and post-cancellation are separate worlds. There is something that longtime viewers of Family Guy have always known, even when they could not quite name it or explain it precisely. It is a feeling more than a conclusion, a sense that the show that returned in 2005 after its 3-year absence was not quite the same object as the show that had been cancelled in 2002. The characters occupied the same names and the same bodies and the same house on the same street. But something was different. Something had shifted in the gap between cancellation and revival, in the years when the show existed only in reruns and DVD sales, and the particular kind of fond memory that cancelled shows generate in people who loved them. The official explanation, the one that production histories and interviews with writers and creators support, is that cancellations scatter writing teams and change the chemistry of a creative enterprise in ways that are difficult to reverse. When a show is cancelled, its writers move on to other projects. New people are hired when the show returns. New people bring different sensibilities. The show changes because the people making it changed. This is almost certainly the most accurate account of what actually happened behind the scenes at Family Guy between 2002 and 2005. But the fan theory we are considering now does not operate at the level of production history. It operates at the level of in-universe logic. And what it proposes, quietly and with surprising structural coherence, is that the explanation for why the show changed is not something that happened in the real world to the people who make it. The explanation is something that happened within the fiction, something that altered the reality of the Family Guy universe at the point of cancellation and left a different reality, a parallel one, in place when the show returned. The multiverse in Family Guy is not a fan invention. It is canonical. The Season 8 episode Road to the Multiverse explicitly establishes that parallel universes exist within the world of Family Guy, that they can be accessed using the right technology, and that the characters who live in them are recognizably similar but subtly and meaningfully different from their counterparts in other branches of reality. Stewie has a remote control device that allows him and Brian to jump between these parallel realities. They visit a universe where Christianity never existed, and scientific advancement leapt forward 1,000 years as a consequence. They visit a universe rendered in the animation style of a popular early animation studio. They visit a universe where dogs are the dominant species and humans are kept as pets. The multiverse exists. The show established it definitively. The theory takes this canonical fact and applies it retroactively to the gap in the show's history. The Family Guy of Seasons 1 through 3 is one universe. The Family Guy of Season 4 and beyond is a different universe entirely. They are not the same continuity at different points in time. They are parallel branches of reality that diverged at the moment of cancellation and that have been growing further apart ever since. When you compile the evidence for this reading, the case becomes surprisingly substantial. Meg Griffin's treatment changes dramatically between the pre-cancellation seasons and the revival. In the first 3 seasons, she is overlooked and occasionally dismissed, but the family as a unit does not direct active contempt at her. Peter is not always a thoughtful or attentive father, but he is sometimes a caring one. The warmth is present. It is not performed. It is real, within the fiction, in a way that reads as the natural baseline of how this family operates when it is functioning as a family at all. By Season 4, something has changed in a way that is difficult to attribute to gradual drift. The shift in how the family relates to Meg is sharp enough, and consistent enough across the revival seasons to suggest a categorical difference rather than an incremental one. Stewie's fundamental character changes in the revival in a way that is well documented and much discussed. The evil genius persona, which was not a secondary trait but the entire identity of the character in the first 3 seasons, recedes in Season 4 and continues to recede until it is mostly gone. The writers have spoken about this as a deliberate creative decision. The theory offers a different explanation. The Stewie of the first universe was on a trajectory that would have continued in its own direction, deepening the evil genius character in ways that the show was prevented from exploring by cancellation. The Stewie of the revival universe is a parallel version, similar in surface presentation, fundamentally different in the trajectory he is on. Brian's transformation across the show's run is equally well documented. The early Brian is the grounded center, the voice of reason, the loyal friend. The revival Brian shifts season by season toward qualities that make him progressively harder to like, while retaining enough of the surface presentation that you can always see who he used to be. In the first universe, Brian was going somewhere. In the second universe, he is going somewhere else. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10 is the theory's most specific piece of textual evidence, and the one that makes the entire framework feel like something the show may have gestured toward intentionally. In that episode, Stewie and Brian use a time machine to travel back to the events of the pilot episode. When they arrive, they notice that things look different. The animation style has changed. The characters feel subtly different from how they feel in the Season 10 present. And crucially, the Meg of the pilot era is treated with a warmth and a basic human decency that the Meg of the revival seasons almost never receives. The theory argues that what Back to the Pilot is actually depicting is not time travel, it is universe travel. Brian and Stewie did not go back to their own past. The device sent them to the original universe, the one that was canceled in 2002, the one that is still running on its own trajectory somewhere in the multiverse. The timeline they returned to when the episode ended was not the future of that first universe. It was the present of the second, the revival universe, the one they actually live in. This reading has a particular emotional weight when you consider what Brian does in the episode. He uses the opportunity of being in the past to try to warn his past self about the September 11th attacks, attempting to change history, to create a version of the future that is better than the one he returned from. The attempt fails. It creates problems. Things get worse before they can be resolved, and Brian ultimately returns to his own universe unchanged. The theory suggests that what Brian was really reaching for, without consciously articulating it, was the chance to stay. To remain in the warmer, more coherent universe where the characters were still on their original trajectories, where Brian was still the Brian of the first 3 seasons and Meg was still treated like a person and the family still had the residual warmth that made it worth caring about. He tried to change things. He could not. He came home. The consolation of the 2 universes theory, and I think it is a genuine consolation even if it is a strange one, is that it insists on the continued existence of the first universe. The original Family Guy, the one from 1999 to 2002, did not simply end and become whatever came after. It branched. It continued on its own trajectory, in its own pocket of the multiverse, with characters who remained on the paths they were originally on. Meg is still treated like a person in that universe. Brian is still the grounded voice of reason. Stewie is still the terrifying evil genius. Peter still feels guilt when he hurts the people he loves. The family still has the warmth. We simply do not have access to that universe anymore. The channel that connected us to it closed when Fox canceled the show in 2002. What came back in 2005 was a different branch, close enough to be recognizable, different enough, if you are paying attention, to feel like something has been lost. Both universes are real. Both families exist. Somewhere in the multiverse, the show that was canceled is still running, still warm, still worth everything that people felt when they first fell in love with it. There is a version of this theory that goes further than the simple observation about tone and character. It looks at specific details embedded in episodes from the revived run and reads them as signals, not from the writers communicating consciously, but from the story itself, from the internal logic of the world, generating artifacts of the transition that nobody planned, but that accumulated anyway. The most striking of these details is what happened to the character of Cleveland Brown during the gap. Cleveland was part of the original group, present from the earliest episodes. as much a fixture of the drunken clam as the bar stools themselves. He was not a character with enormous complexity in those first 3 seasons, but he had a specific weight, a specific gravity, a way of occupying his scenes that felt like evidence of someone who had been in a place long enough that the place had shaped him. He belonged on Spooner Street the way a worn piece of furniture belongs in a room. You do not examine it closely. It is simply there, and its being there is part of what makes the room feel like itself. Then the show was canceled. Cleveland was among the things that did not exist for 3 years, in any active sense. He was on DVD, he was in reruns on Adult Swim, but he was not being added to, not being written, not being given new experiences in the primary timeline. When the show returned, Cleveland continued through the revival seasons, but something had shifted. He was the same in the surface sense, same voice, same name, same barstool. But the Cleveland of the post-revival seasons had a quality that the original did not quite have, a quality of slight dislocation, of existing in the neighborhood without being entirely native to it. Not obviously, not in a way that called attention to itself, but in a way that was detectable if you were looking for it. The theory notes that this is exactly what you would expect from a character who crossed from one universe to the other and retained some residual awareness of the crossing. Cleveland, on some level, knows that he is not in the place he was. The people are the same, and the street is the same, and the bar is the same, but the universe has a different texture, and something in him registers that, without being able to name it. Eventually, the show gave Cleveland his own spin-off. He moved to Virginia with a new family. He built a different life in a different place. The theory reads this as Cleveland following the logic of his own displacement, going further from the original point of origin rather than trying to return to it, because return was never possible, and some part of him understood that from the beginning. The version of this theory that focuses on the show's internal emotional trajectory rather than its narrative mechanics makes a point that is harder to argue with. The first 3 seasons of Family Guy had a quality of warmth that was not simply a function of the characters being more likable. It was a quality of the world itself. The world those characters inhabited was one in which love and consequence and growth were possible, in which actions had weight, in which the family's dysfunction existed against a background of genuine mutual investment. It was not a gentle world, but it was one in which gentleness was possible and occasionally achieved. The world the show returned to in 2005 had the same map, the same streets, the same house, but the gentleness was harder to find. Not absent, not immediately, but harder, as though the quality of the world that made gentleness possible had been diluted somehow by the crossing, by the gap, by whatever process moved the characters from one version of the show's reality into the other. This is the version of the theory that feels true in the way that theories feel true when they are tracking something real about emotional experience rather than narrative logistics. The canceled and revived show is not the same show. Everyone who has loved a show that was canceled and brought back knows this. You are glad it came back, you watch it gratefully. But the texture is different. Something in the gap did something. You cannot point at it and explain it precisely. It is just there, in the way the world feels, in the specific gravity of the scenes you watch, in the quality of presence the characters have in their own lives. 2 universes, one name, one address, one group of people who look exactly alike and share all the same memories but who are not quite the same family. Not anymore, not after the gap. The Griffins of the first universe loved each other in a way that asked something of them. The Griffins of the second universe love each other, sometimes in a way that asks very little, that comes easily when it comes, and is absent without consequence when it does not. The love is still there, but it lives in a different world now, a world with different rules. And the rules, once changed, do not go back. Section 4. The Griffins are in purgatory, on the theology of a dysfunctional Rhode Island family. Every fictional universe of sufficient age and ambition generates, eventually, a theory about death. It is almost a requirement of the form. The longer a story runs and the more inconsistencies it accumulates, the more inviting the idea becomes that the explanation for all those inconsistencies is not narrative carelessness, but something more fundamental. The characters are dead. They have been dead the whole time. Everything we have been watching is the afterlife. Family Guy is not unique in this. The Simpsons has generated these theories. Lost resolved itself in a way that made the theory feel almost vindicated. Various other long-running shows have attracted similar speculation, but Family Guy's version of the theory is particularly well developed and particularly coherent because the specific qualities of each character's situation map onto the theological concept of purgatory with a precision that is genuinely striking once you start looking at it seriously. Purgatory, in the tradition that gave the concept its most developed articulation, is neither heaven nor hell. It is the middle place, the waiting room, the realm for souls who are neither irredeemably damned nor yet ready for whatever comes after. They have done things wrong. They carry weight, but they are salvageable. The function of purgatory is not punishment in the punitive sense, but transformation in the refining sense. You are there to work through whatever remains unresolved about the life you lived. The difficulty is the curriculum. The goal is emergence, eventually lighter. Consider Stewie Griffin through this lens. In the first seasons of the show, he is unambiguously an evil genius. His entire identity is organized around malice, domination, and the destruction of anyone who stands between him and his goals, beginning with his own mother. If you are cataloging the qualities that require purgatorial attention, Stewie's list would be extensive. The callousness, the contempt for human life, the absolute prioritization of his own ambitions over any consideration of the people around him. These are not minor character flaws. These are qualities that, in a theological accounting, would require significant work before any good destination could even be considered. And yet, watching the show over its full run, what you observe in Stewie's character is exactly what purgatory is supposed to produce. He becomes less evil. The evil genius persona gives way to something softer and more emotionally complex. He develops genuine affection for Brian. He demonstrates the capacity for loyalty and sacrifice and real friendship. He becomes, inch by inch across decades of the show's run, a version of himself that is capable of more than the original was. The evil is working its way out of him. Not quickly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. This is Stewie's purgatory. He is the soul whose primary unresolved business is the capacity for love. He had none at the beginning. He is slowly, stubbornly, against the resistance of his own nature, developing it. Lois follows a trajectory that goes in the opposite direction, and this is where the theory becomes most interesting. In the early seasons, Lois is the character who most consistently does the right thing. She is patient where Peter is impulsive. She is thoughtful where the rest of the family is heedless. She maintains the family's connection to something resembling functional adult behavior in the face of everything Peter and the children throw at the situation. She appears, in other words, to be the character with the least purgatorial work to do. But purgatory is not interested in the performance of virtue. It is interested in the substance of character beneath the performance. And as the seasons progress, the substance beneath Lois's performed goodness becomes progressively more visible. She is capable of coldness she did not show in the early seasons. She is capable of selfishness she would once have refused. She participates in the treatment of Meg in ways that early Lois would have actively resisted. The real Lois is emerging, and the real Lois has more work to do than the performed version suggested. Her purgatory is the exposure of the self she spent her living years managing. She was a woman of wealth and privilege and considerable capability, who chose to present as devoted and self-sacrificing and unfailingly patient. Those qualities were real, partly, but they were also a management strategy, a way of maintaining the image of a certain kind of person without fully reckoning with the parts of herself that did not fit that image. In purgatory, the management fails. The unmanaged parts surface, and she has to sit with them in front of an audience who used to believe the performance. Brian's purgatory is the specific torment of the person who always knew better and could never quite manage to be better. He possesses genuine intelligence. He has real aesthetic and ethical sensibility. He can identify the good with considerable precision. He simply cannot sustain the behavior that the good requires. The gap between his stated values and his actual conduct is not incidental. It is the defining feature of his existence. And in purgatory, that gap is on permanent display, enforced by the presence of people who have heard his stated values often enough to notice every time his conduct falls short of them. The humiliation of late-era Brian, the insufferability that fans discuss with such exasperated familiarity, is not just bad character writing. It is the soul doing its assigned work. He is learning, with enormous resistance and very little grace, what it costs to be the person he believes himself to be. The learning is not going well, but purgatory does not grade on pace. It grades on eventual completion. Peter's purgatory is the most straightforwardly structured. He is the soul of the person who loved deeply and genuinely, but loved badly, who meant well across the entire span of his life and executed poorly across most of it, who kept reaching for the right thing and consistently grasping the wrong one instead. His difficulty is not lack of love. It is lack of the specific discipline and self-awareness required to translate love into consistent good behavior toward the people he loves. He knows he loves his family. He cannot figure out how to show it reliably. This is what he is in purgatory to learn, and the show is the record of that learning happening very slowly over a very long time with frequent backsliding. Meg's situation within the purgatorial framework requires you to believe that her suffering is not merely the cruelty of bad writing. Within the theory, her suffering is the curriculum she was assigned. Some versions of the theory suggest she was, in her living life, someone who participated in exactly the kind of social exclusion she is now subject to, and that her purgatorial assignment is to understand from the receiving end what she once inflicted. Other versions are gentler and argue that Meg's purgatory is not punishment but formation, that the specific kind of patience and resilience and unconditional love she is developing, the capacity to go on trying to connect even when connection is repeatedly refused, are qualities that are being built in her through the experience of their denial. She is being refined by the difficulty. What emerges, when the process completes, will be someone capable of a grace that the people who tormented her could not access. This reading makes Meg's endurance meaningful rather than tragic. She is not just absorbing abuse, she is becoming something, and purgatory, which has a plan for everyone, has a particular one for her. The hell version of the theory, which requires less theological nuance but more dramatic commitment, proposes that the characters are not working towards something better, but being held in exactly the condition that most specifically denies them their truest selves, forever, without the promise of emergence. Stewie is an adult genius trapped in a body that the world categorically refuses to take seriously. He is brilliant, he is indestructible. He cannot access any of the power that his intellect deserves because he is an infant. He is dependent on people he considers inferior for his most basic needs. He cannot walk confidently, he cannot drive, he cannot vote or publish or be heard in any forum that matters. He is the most capable person in his household, and he is fed pureed food and placed in a crib at 7 o'clock. The humiliation is total and perpetual and perfectly calibrated. Lois is a woman of exceptional capability and cultivation, trapped in a domestic context that perpetually underutilizes her. She gave up a wealthy and socially rich life to become a housewife in a working-class neighborhood. She is married to a man who does not deserve her. She is perpetually overqualified for the life she is living. In hell, this is her sentence. All that potential, all that background, all that intelligence, and eternity wiping up Peter's messes. Brian is the intellectual whom no one can take seriously as one. The body he is in invalidates every credential he claims. He cannot be a novelist because no publisher will take a novel from a dog. He cannot be a romantic partner to the women he loves because they cannot love a dog the way he needs to be loved. He cannot be the person his consciousness is without being perpetually reminded by his physical form that the world does not believe his consciousness justifies the title of person. His sentence is perpetual aspiration in a body that makes aspiration permanently ridiculous. Whether purgatory or hell, the theory insists on meaning beneath the chaos. The characters are not simply going through things for no reason. There is a logic to their arrangements, moral rather than narrative, distributing its difficulties according to some larger plan. The suffering is not random. The strangeness is not pointless. Somewhere underneath everything, something is working. Whether that something has an end in view is the question the theory cannot quite answer. But the hope that it does is perhaps what makes it worth believing. Let us dwell longer inside this framework, because the details of it have a weight that a summary does not fully transmit. The traditional understanding of purgatory, and this is the version that the theory draws on most specifically, is not a place of punishment. That distinction matters enormously. Hell is punishment. Purgatory is preparation. The suffering that occurs there is not vindictive. It is not a debt being paid in pain. It is a process of purification, of the gradual removal of the attachments and distortions that prevent a soul from being able to receive what it is ultimately moving toward. The pain is real, And it is significant, but it is purposeful. It is the pain of something being cleaned, or corrected, or slowly aligned with its true nature. This distinction changes how you read every character on the show. Peter is not being punished for his failures as a father and a husband. He is being given, season after season, episode after episode, the repeated opportunity to learn what his failures actually cost, so that when the learning finally takes hold, there will be nothing left in him that does not understand it. The problem, and the show demonstrates this with extraordinary consistency, is that the lesson does not take. He learns it in an episode and forgets it between episodes. The purification is not progressing. Peter is cycling through the same revelations without retaining them. This is the theological question the theory does not fully resolve. Is Peter's failure to retain the lessons a sign that the process is still working? That it simply requires more iterations than usual? Or is it a sign of something else, something that purgatory was not designed to accommodate? There are traditions that allow for the possibility that certain souls cannot complete the process, that the distortions in them are too deeply embedded to be corrected by the standard mechanism. The theory does not take a position on which of these applies to Peter. It leaves the question open, which is perhaps the most honest thing it could do. Lois's situation is more acute and more specific. Her suffering has a quality of exhaustion that the purgatorial framework reads as evidence of a soul that has been holding itself together by force for an extended period. The early Lois is someone who manages, with difficulty and with occasional failure, to maintain her moral center under significant pressure. She does this because the soul that she is, at its deepest level, knows what it is trying to become, and the effort to become it is still active and still directed. The later Lois is someone in whom that effort has become less consistent. The center still exists, but the force maintaining it has weakened. She acts in ways that the early Lois would have refused, not because her essential nature has changed, but because the sustained effort of maintaining it against the pressure of the environment she is in has taken more than she had to give. This is not moral failure in the ordinary sense. It is the result of inadequate support, of a purgatorial process that provides the difficulty without providing the companionship or the relief that make the difficulty survivable. Brian's role in this theology is the one that rewards the most sustained attention. Brian understands more of what is happening than any other character. This has always been implicit in his function on the show, the voice of reason, the one who looks at the chaos and recognizes it for what it is, who maintains a relationship with reality that the other characters cannot quite manage. But in the purgatorial reading, this awareness is a specifically spiritual quality. Brian is the character who, on some level, knows that this place is not the final destination, who senses that the things happening around him are significant in a way that exceeds their immediate comedic content. His suffering, the failed novel, the romantic disasters, the slow erosion of his best qualities into something that is easier to maintain but harder to respect, is the suffering of awareness without the ability to act on what you are aware of. He knows more than the others. He cannot fix anything because knowledge without sufficient will is insufficient. In theological terms, Brian is the character struggling most explicitly with the gap between intellectual understanding and genuine transformation. He understands what is required. The understanding has not yet produced the change it is supposed to produce. Stewie's arc reads in this framework as the arc of a soul that arrived, carrying the loudest and most dramatic distortions, the grandiosity, the violence, the absolute conviction that the world should reorganize itself around his preferences, and is being systematically relieved of them. The evil genius fading, the world domination plots retreating, the capacity for genuine love and loyalty expanding into the space the old ambitions occupied. This is what purification looks like when it is actually working. Stewie is the only character whose trajectory within the purgatorial framework constitutes genuine progress. He arrived as one thing and is becoming something different, something closer to what the process is intended to produce. Meg, as we have established, carries the weight that the other characters cannot look at directly. The theory reads her not as a soul in her own process of purification, but as the mechanism by which the other soul's processes are activated. Her suffering is not for her own spiritual development. It is the suffering of the one who holds the truth that everyone else needs to face, and who pays the cost of holding it in the form of how everyone around her treats her. She is necessary. She is the linchpin of a system that would fall apart without her. The cruelty directed at her is the cruelty of people who cannot bear what she represents, deflected outward because it cannot be faced directly. This makes Meg the most important character in the entire purgatorial structure, even as she is treated as the least important character in the narrative. The invisible load-bearing wall. The thing the building cannot stand without, that no one notices until it is gone. Section 5. Brian Griffin, the CIA, and the human trapped inside the dog. Brian Griffin has always been the central mystery of Family Guy. Not because his character is opaque or difficult to understand in the usual sense, but because his existence is genuinely impossible to explain by any normal logic the show provides or implies. He talks. He drives a car. He writes novels, badly but persistently. He has romantic relationships with human women that he takes seriously. He reads substantial literature. He has a son who is a fully human teenage boy with no canine characteristics whatsoever. He drinks martinis from an actual martini glass and holds opinions about the state of contemporary culture with the confidence of someone who has spent decades developing those opinions and finding them confirmed by experience. And he is, physically, a white Labrador mix of approximately medium size, and in certain episodes you can watch him eat from a bowl on the floor of the Griffin kitchen. The show has never explained this. It has never offered an in-universe reason for why Brian is the specific kind of entity he is. He is simply presented as the talking dog who lives with the Griffins, and the humor often derives from the gap between his human intellectual pretensions and his fundamentally animal existence. But the actual mechanism behind his uniqueness, why he is different from every other dog in the show's universe, why he alone of all the animals in fictional Rhode Island can discuss Dostoevsky and write bad fiction and maintain a complicated relationship with self-doubt, this has never been addressed. The theory that has accumulated the most substantive evidence in fan communities draws on the established lore of Family Guy's sister series American Dad to propose an answer. Brian Griffin is a CIA experiment. Specifically, the product of the same program that created Klaus, the talking goldfish of the Smith household in Langley Falls, Virginia. Klaus is not a figure of ambiguity in American Dad. His origin is explicitly stated and repeatedly referenced. He is Klaus Heisler, a German Olympic ski jumper whose brain was surgically removed and implanted into the body of a goldfish by the Central Intelligence Agency as part of a classified operation. He is now a fish who speaks German and several other languages, who has opinions about his situation and about the world, who has something approaching a full emotional and intellectual life, and who lives in a bowl in the Smith family's kitchen, unable to leave it without assistance. He knows exactly what he is and what was done to him. He has memories of his human life. He finds the limitations of his current existence both infuriating and occasionally, darkly, funny. The CIA in the shared universe of Family Guy and American Dad is an organization that has already demonstrated the willingness and the technical capability to perform exactly this kind of operation. They have taken a human consciousness and placed it inside an animal body. The result is a creature that is functionally human in every meaningful sense, possessed of language and emotion and memory and personality while being physically constrained to an animal form. This is not fan speculation. This is stated, canonical, on-screen fact. Brian's litter, as established in an episode that briefly explores his origins, came from ordinary dogs. His mother was a regular pet animal. His siblings were normal. They did the things that dogs do. None of them walked or talked or had complicated romantic histories or opinions about Hemingway or unfinished novels in progress. Brian was the only one. Of an entire litter that shared his biological origin, he alone emerged with a human-level consciousness operating inside a canine body. If this were simply a result of natural variation, you would expect to encounter other dogs in the Family Guy universe with similar qualities. You do not. Other dogs are dogs. Brian is not the upper end of a spectrum. He is a categorical exception to the rule. And categorical exceptions of this specific type, in a universe where the CIA has already been established as capable of producing them, have a specific cause. The experiment produced Brian the way it produced Klaus, a human consciousness implanted into a canine host. The specific details of whose consciousness and when the operation was performed and what the intended purpose was are not provided by the theory. These details may be genuinely unknowable, but the fact of the transplant, once accepted, explains everything that is otherwise inexplicable about Brian. His son Dylan. Dylan is a teenage boy who is biologically Brian's son. Dylan is not partially canine. Dylan is entirely human in appearance, behavior, and as far as the show establishes, biology. If Brian's body is a dog's body, and he fathered this child in the ordinary way, the child should have some canine characteristics. He has none. If Brian's consciousness is human, and if the biological mechanism behind whatever the CIA did produces offspring that reflect the human donor's genetics rather than the canine host bodies, then a fully human child becomes possible, if not exactly easy to explain in precise biological terms. The pseudoscience of the explanation is consistent with the pseudoscience already established by Klaus's situation, his deteriorating character across the show's seasons. This is the element of Brian's story that has generated the most fan discussion and the most genuine distress among viewers who found the early Brian compelling and the later Brian difficult to defend. The theory offers an explanation that is both more specific and more tragic than simple flanderization. A human consciousness placed in a dog's brain is working with a significantly smaller and differently structured neural architecture than the one it was built for. The human brain is considerably more complex than the canine one. The consciousness inside Brian is doing what it can with what it has, which is why he is as functional as he is. But the medium is smaller than the message. Certain capabilities persist, certain ones do not. And decades of sustained alcohol abuse, which Brian engages in with a consistency that the show treats as a personality trait but which reads, within this framework, as something closer to self-medication for a condition that has no other available treatment, would accelerate whatever neurological degradation the arrangement already produces. The early Brian, whose intelligence was practical and grounded and emotionally functional, is the Brian before the long-term effects have accumulated significantly. The later Brian, whose intelligence persists in surface ways while his judgment and his empathy and his actual wisdom deteriorate, is the Brian in whom the cumulative cost of his situation has become visible. He is getting worse not because the writers stopped caring about his character arc, though that may also be true, but because the thing that was done to him was always going to cost him something over time. The consciousness that was placed in a body too small for it has been paying the installation fee for decades. There is a question at the center of this theory that the theory cannot answer, and that perhaps no theory could. If Brian is a human consciousness in a dog's body, then he was once a person, a real person, someone with a name and a history and people in their life who knew them. That person is gone now in the sense that the body is gone. But the consciousness, the specific and irreplaceable accumulation of memory and personality and experience that constitutes a self, that is still here, drinking martinis, watching the Griffin family from the floor of their living room, trying, with diminishing capacity and increasing desperation, to be something more than the dog everyone else sees. His loneliness is not a character trait. It is the exact shape of what was done to him. He is the most isolated creature in the show, not because he is antisocial or difficult to be around, though he becomes both of those things in the later seasons, but because there is no one who can fully understand what his life is. Klaus across town in Langley Falls might understand, but Klaus does not know Brian exists. So Brian drinks alone at the bar. He writes the novel that never gets finished. He falls in love with women who cannot quite love him back in the way his consciousness needs, because his body forecloses that reciprocity before it can begin. He argues about books and politics and the state of the world with people who are not quite listening. He goes on, because that is what the self does, regardless of the container it has been given. It goes on. Let us follow the evidence further, because the CIA theory does not stop at Brian's origin. It extends into the logic of his behavior across the whole run of the show in ways that, once you begin looking, become very difficult to unsee. Consider what Brian's life on Spooner Street actually consists of. He lives with a family that did not choose him, and that he did not choose, in a suburban neighborhood in a mid-sized fictional city, in a body that does not belong to him. He drinks martinis in quantities that would not be possible for an ordinary dog of his size and weight. He drives a car. He has a literary career, or the aspirations of one. He dates human women. He participates in the full texture of adult human social life, as though the fact of his body is a purely cosmetic difference. The theory asks, how is this possible? Not the logistical how, not the fictional handwave that allows a talking dog to exist in this world, but the experiential how. How does a consciousness that was human navigate the daily experience of a body that is not? How does it not break under the weight of that specific dislocation? The answer the theory provides is that it does break, in slow motion, across the full run of the series. What fans and critics have described as Brian's character deterioration, the increasingly selfish behavior, the pretension, the hypocrisy, the gap between who he presents as and how he actually treats people, is not a writing failure or a decision to make the character more interesting through conflict. It is the gradual fracturing of a consciousness that was not designed for the life it is living. The original Brian, the one in the earliest seasons, is a person trying to maintain himself, trying to hold together the qualities that defined the human being he was before the experiment. The intelligence, the values, the care for the people around him. These qualities require continuous maintenance under the best circumstances. Under the circumstances of being a dog, of having the wrong body, of being unable to explain to anyone what you actually are or why the things that matter to you matter in the ways they do, the maintenance requires an effort that is almost heroic. As the seasons progress, the maintenance becomes harder. Small failures accumulate. The pretension that irritates people is the effort to assert intellectual credibility in a context where the body he is wearing makes intellectual credibility difficult to claim. The womanizing is an attempt to maintain a connection to a human social life that is always being undermined by what he is. The dishonesty is the dishonesty of someone who cannot tell the truth, because the truth is the one thing that would make everything worse. Brian is not a bad person who became good and then became bad again. He is a person in an impossible situation who is slowly running out of the resources required to be his best self in it. Every bad behavior the later seasons document is the behavior of a consciousness losing its grip on what it was, reaching for substitutes that can be obtained within the constraints of its current existence, making choices that the original person would not have made because the original person was not in this situation. Klaus, in American Dad, provides the comparison that makes this legible. Klaus is a human consciousness placed into a goldfish. He adapts differently than Brian does, and the theory notes that the differences in adaptation track the differences in the experiment's design and the differences in the host body. A fish has far fewer capabilities than a dog. Klaus cannot pretend to be fully human in the way Brian can. He cannot drive or date or attempt a literary career. His situation is so visibly impossible that there is no performance of normalcy available to him. He simply is what he is, openly, with no alternative. And paradoxically, this makes him more integrated, more at peace, in his way, with the facts of his existence. He has no performance to maintain. The cognitive effort that Brian expends on maintaining the fiction of being essentially human is effort that Klaus does not spend, because there is no fiction of that kind available to maintain. Brian spends everything on the performance. And what happens to performers who cannot come out of character, who are required to perform indefinitely without rest, without an audience that knows they are performing, without any acknowledgement of the gap between the character and the person playing it, is that they lose the person. The character takes over, not because the person was weak, but because performance at sufficient duration and intensity becomes indistinguishable from identity. The Brian of the later seasons is not the character taking over, he is the human taking over. But a human who has been living as something else for long enough that the original human has become as much a performance as the dog ever was. He has forgotten, in the deepest sense, what it felt like to be entirely himself. The intelligence is still there, the voice is still there, but the full integration of the person who was placed into this body is no longer fully accessible. The CIA experiment succeeded, in other words, in ways it may not have intended. It did not simply place a human consciousness into an animal body. It created a new thing, neither fully the human who was implanted nor fully the dog who was the host, but something specific to the duration and the conditions of the experiment. Something that the original project parameters did not predict, and that nobody who designed the experiment has come to check on. Brian has been alone with it for a very long time. Section 6. The Meg Revelation, what Stewie's true origin changes about every scene they share. There is a theory about Meg and Stewie Griffin that reshapes the emotional architecture of almost every scene they share across the show's 25-plus seasons. It is not a comfortable theory. It resolves nothing cleanly, but it has textual support that is specific enough to be difficult to dismiss, and an emotional logic that fits the show's treatment of Meg in a way that nothing simpler quite manages to. The theory is this: Meg Griffin is Stewie Griffin's biological mother. This requires some careful building, so let us take it from the beginning. Before the events of the show begin, before the first episode, Before the family is the family the audience knows, Meg was a young teenager, 15 or perhaps 16. She was already the overlooked one in the household, already the person who received the least warmth and the least attention, already navigating the social difficulties of adolescence without much support from the people around her. And during this period, she was in a relationship, a boyfriend, someone who was part of her life during a specific window of time. That window closed, in the way that teenage relationships close, suddenly and incompletely, leaving Meg without him. And leaving her pregnant, Lois found out. And Lois, faced with this specific kind of impossible situation that sometimes confronts mothers of teenage daughters, made a decision. She would handle it. She would help Meg through the pregnancy discreetly. She would tell Peter, who was not then and is not now a person who scrutinizes things carefully, that she herself was expecting another child. She would manage the presentation, and when Meg gave birth, quietly, away from the family's primary attention, Lois would register the baby as her own. Brian helped. This is the most inferential element of the theory, depending not on explicit evidence but on the quality of Brian's relationship with Meg in the early seasons, which has a specific protective texture that goes beyond what the show's general treatment of her would predict. Brian knows things. He has always been the character who is present for things that others miss, who carries information in a specific knowing way, who has a relationship with the truth of the household that is more complete than anyone else's. The theory reads this quality as the product of complicity. He helped Lois. He knows what happened. And his early protectiveness toward Meg, in the seasons before the show decided to make her the punching bag, is the protectiveness of someone who understands the specific weight she is carrying. When Stewie was born, he was registered as Lois's third child. Peter accepted this. Chris accepted this. And Meg was required to be silent, to watch her son grow up in the same house she lived in, knowing what he did not know, knowing what no one else could be allowed to know, and calling him her brother and being satisfied with that, being required to be satisfied with that. The piece of supporting evidence that gives this theory more than speculative weight appears in the Season 8 episode Partial Terms of Endearment, which deals with the subject of surrogacy. In that episode, in the course of a scene that is otherwise concerned with other things, Lois makes a direct statement that Meg gave birth to Stewie. The line is delivered in a context that frames it as a joke. The show's audience is expected to laugh and move on, but the theory argues that the joke is a delivery mechanism, a way of putting true information into the show without the show having to take responsibility for it. Family Guy has always used comedy as a container for things it cannot address directly. This is one of those things. The emotional implications for Meg's entire character arc are substantial enough to change the texture of revisiting any episode in which she and Stewie share screen time. She is not simply the overlooked teenager. She is a girl who gave up her child, who watches her son grow up every day in a context where she cannot acknowledge what he actually is to her, who sits across the dinner table from the person she carried and surrendered and must call him brother and treat it as normal and go on. The specific quality of Meg's suffering across the show, which has always carried an emotional weight that seems disproportionate to her stated situation, becomes coherent within this reading. She is not just the unpopular girl at school or the least favored child in the family. She is a person living inside a secret that rewrites the meaning of every interaction she has in her own house. Her willingness to endure the abuse the show directs at her without escalating in ways that might rupture the family, without forcing the kind of confrontation that would require things to be said that cannot be unsaid, reads differently within this framework. She endures because she cannot afford not to. Anything that destabilizes the family structure, anything that forces a genuine accounting of who people are to each other, risks the secret coming out. And the secret is not hers alone to risk. It belongs to Stewie too. It belongs to the life he has built in the family that raised him. Protecting him, is worth the cost of being treated badly. She has already paid a larger cost than anyone around her knows. The famous episode in Season 10 where Meg finally snaps and confronts her family about their treatment of her ends with her voluntarily returning to her role as the punching bag. This ending has been criticized extensively as the show's most troubling endorsement of abuse dynamics. The theory offers a reading that does not endorse the ending but does explain Meg's choice. She went too far in the confrontation. She got close to territory that she cannot allow to be explored. The family, faced with Meg's actual feelings and actual demands, began to turn on each other in ways that threatened the stability that protects the secret. She pulled back, not because she believes she deserves the abuse, but because her son's security and his family, her son, who does not know she is his mother, matters more than her own dignity in any given moment. She walked back to her seat and said nothing. She has been saying nothing for the entire show. She has been paying that particular price every day, without acknowledgement, without credit, without anyone knowing that it is being paid. Meg is the most human character in the show. This has always been true. The theory about Stewie being her son does not make her situation more tragic so much as it makes it more specific, more explicable. It gives the quiet suffering a name and a shape that the show itself never quite provides. She loved him enough to give him up. She loves him enough to stay silent. She will love him enough to keep absorbing whatever the family directs at her for as many seasons as the show runs. That is what the theory says. And once you have heard it, it is difficult to watch a single scene between them the same way. The theory requires us to do the math, and the math is what makes it so disorienting once you complete it. Stewie Griffin, in the canonical timeline of the show, is 1 year old. 1 year old. He has been 1 year old since the 31st of January 1999. He will be 1 year old indefinitely. This is the standard animated sitcom logic of non-aging, applied to a character whose non-aging produces more specific implications than it does for anyone else on the show. Meg Griffin was 17 years old when the show began. She has been 17 years old for the entire run of the series. She was therefore 17 years old at the moment when Stewie was conceived, during the period the show treats as the normal family background. The Meg is Stewie's mother theory does not ask you to accept anything supernatural. It does not require time travel, though the fan theories that extend it in that direction are imaginative and occasionally compelling. It asks you only to accept the most direct and literal reading of the age gap between these two characters, taken seriously. Meg was 17. She became pregnant. The pregnancy was managed in the way that families of a certain type, in a certain era, sometimes managed inconvenient pregnancies. The child was absorbed into the household as the youngest sibling. Meg remained Meg. The baby became Stewie. Peter and Lois became, for all official purposes, his parents. The theory's most immediately available evidence is Stewie's treatment of Lois. The obsession with her destruction, so consistent and so specific in those early seasons, is not the behavior of a child who dislikes his mother. It is the behavior of a child who has been told, in ways both explicit and ambient, a version of the truth that does not quite add up. He knows something is wrong. He cannot name it. The wrongness focuses itself, through the alchemy of an infant's pre-verbal processing, into hostility directed at the woman who has claimed the role of mother without having earned it in the way that the role is supposed to be earned. Lois loves Stewie. The theory does not dispute this. But Stewie's deepest self knows that the love, however real, has a complicated origin. That Lois's claim on him was accepted rather than biological. That somewhere in the household there is someone whose claim is biological and who has been required, by circumstances that were not her choice, to accept the secondary role. The reason this matters is Meg. Meg's treatment by Stewie in the early seasons is notably different from his treatment of Lois. Stewie targets Lois with elaborate hostility. His relationship with Meg is more ambivalent. There are moments, scattered through the early run, where Stewie's response to Meg has a quality that does not quite fit the sibling dynamic the show presents. A quality of recognition, of something being felt that cannot be explained by the official family structure. As the seasons continue and Stewie softens, as the evil genius recedes and the emotional depth expands, his relationship with Meg becomes one of the more interesting quiet threads in the show's background. He is not cruel to her in the way that the rest of the family is cruel to her. His occasional casual dismissals feel different from Peter's contempt or Chris's oblivious participation in the family's treatment of her. They feel more like the performed distance of someone who knows they are not supposed to feel what they feel and is working to maintain the appropriate attitude. The fan theories that extend this premise into time travel territory ask what happens when Stewie, given a time machine, eventually discovers the truth. Some versions have him going back to meet Meg at 17, encountering the person who is simultaneously his sister and his mother, and his most significant source of unresolved feeling about what a family actually owes its members. Some versions follow Stewie into the knowledge without allowing him to act on it, leaving him to carry the information alone in the way that the information was carried by everyone else who knew before him. The quieter version, the one that does not require extrapolation, simply sits with the existing evidence. A teenage girl had a baby. The baby was raised as her sibling. The baby, on some level that precedes language and explicit memory, knows something is not right about the family he is living in. He is angry at his mother and does not know why. He reaches for his sister with a recognition he cannot explain. He has all the intelligence in the world, and none of the context needed to use it to understand his own situation. He is building a time machine in his bedroom. Eventually, he may find his way to the answer. Whether he would be glad to have it is the question the theory, wisely, declines to answer. A quiet interlude on the nature of fan theories and why they matter. Before we move into the final theories, it is worth pausing here for a moment. Not because we have run out of ground to cover, but because this is the kind of pause the night invites. The kind that happens naturally somewhere in the middle of a long conversation, when both people have been talking for a while and the talking has gone somewhere neither of them entirely expected, and there is a quality of recognition in the room that wants to be acknowledged before it is moved past. Fan theories are a strange artifact of the relationship between audiences and the stories they love. They are not criticism, exactly. They do not require expertise or distance, or the specific kind of analytical rigor that formal criticism demands. They are something more like prayer, in the secular sense that the word sometimes carries. An act of sustained, directed attention towards something that matters to the person performing it. An attempt to be in a more complete relationship with a thing than the thing, as officially presented, quite allows. The show is what it is. The show ends where it ends. The credits roll, the next episode begins. There is no space within the official text for the questions the audience brings to it, for the parts that do not add up, for the experiences of watching that exceed what the show explicitly offers. Fan theories are what happens in that space. They are the audience's response to the invitation that fiction always makes and never quite completes. The invitation is, here is a world, here are people in it, here is what happens to them. The incompleteness is, but not everything. Not the parts that happen between episodes. Not the reasons for the things that do not have official reasons. Not the internal experience of being these people in this world. Not the questions the show raises and cannot answer within its own format. Fan theories answer those questions. They complete the incompleteness. They do this badly sometimes, with conclusions that do not hold up or evidence that is coincidental, or explanations that say more about the theorist's anxieties than about the text. And they do it well sometimes, with a precision and an emotional accuracy that makes you feel, reading them, that you have finally understood something you have been trying to understand for a long time without knowing what you were trying to understand. The theories in this collection, the ones we have been sitting with tonight, fall mostly into the second category. Not because they are correct in any verifiable sense, not because Seth MacFarlane intended any of them, or because the writers were encoding secret messages in the character behavior, or because the show is more coherent than it sometimes appears to be. They fall into the second category because they are paying attention to something real. They are noticing the gaps between what the show shows and what it implies, and they are filling those gaps with ideas that are emotionally accurate to the experience of watching and to the specific texture of what it is like to love a flawed thing for a long time. To love a flawed thing for a long time is the condition of most love. The thing you love is never, fully, what you hoped it would be. It falls short in specific and sometimes painful ways. It makes choices you would not have made. It changes in directions that feel like losses, and you love it anyway, not despite the flaws, but alongside them, because the alternative is to love only things that are perfect, which is to love nothing at all, because nothing is. Family Guy is that for a lot of people. The flawed thing they have loved for a long time. The show that was brilliant once and became something else and remained something, even in the diminished form, that they kept watching, that they kept thinking about, that they kept finding worth the effort of theory and conversation, and nights like this one. The theories we have explored are expressions of that love. They are the audience doing the extra work, the work the show itself stopped doing at some point, the work of finding the depth in the characters and the meaning in the world, and the reason for things that the show, in its later seasons, largely stopped offering. The audience filled the gaps because the show stopped filling them. The love continued because love, once established, tends to continue even when the beloved stops earning it. That is not a criticism, that is just the shape of it, the shape of the long relationship with the flawed thing, the shape of tonight, and of the many nights like it that preceded this one, where someone sat in the dark and thought about Peter Griffin and what he might really be, and what Brian might be carrying, and what Stewie might secretly know, and what all of it might mean if you held it a certain way in a certain light. The meaning you found was real, wherever you found it. Section 7. Stewie caused the Big Bang and accidentally built the universe. What we are about to discuss is not fan speculation, and it is worth establishing that clearly before we proceed, because it is one of those things that sounds so implausible as a summary that you might assume it was invented by an enthusiastic fan with too much time and too liberal a relationship with canon. It was not. This happened in the show. It was depicted explicitly, in full, with a proper dramatic reveal, and the show then continued to the next episode as though it had not just established that one of its characters is the necessary and sufficient cause of the existence of all physical reality. Stewie Griffin caused the Big Bang. The episode that establishes this is from Season 9. In the course of one of Stewie and Brian's misadventures with the time machine, they end up outside the space-time continuum entirely. Not in a different time period or a parallel universe, but in the void that preceded the universe, the nothing that existed before anything existed. The laws of physics do not apply in this place, because the laws of physics are part of the something that has not yet happened. Stewie's return pad, the device he built to navigate back to their point of origin, cannot function here. The return pad works by locking onto coordinates. Coordinates require space. Space requires the universe. The universe is currently not present. They have no way home. The only option that presents itself is to overload the return pad's reactor, releasing enough energy to generate a force powerful enough to propel them back into reality. This is dangerous, potentially fatal. They have no alternative. Stewie triggers the overload. The explosion works. They are propelled back into the universe, which snaps into existence around them, and they are home in the Griffin living room, alive, and the matter resolved. Several days later, Stewie is working with characteristic scientific rigor. He compares two data sets. First, the cosmic background radiation from the Big Bang, the residual thermal energy that permeates the entire observable universe as the echo of the event that created it approximately 13.8 billion years ago. Second, the energy spectrum produced by his return pad's overloaded reactor. The comparison reveals something that should be impossible. They match exactly. Stewie states the conclusion plainly. The energy that created the universe was the energy from his return pad. The Big Bang was the accident that happened when he and Brian needed a way home. All of physical reality, every galaxy and every star and every planet that orbits every star, every ocean and every mountain and every ecosystem, and every living thing that has ever existed or will ever exist, every moment of history in both directions from this present moment, every piece of music, and every work of literature, and every mathematical proof, and every love story, and every tragedy, it all traces its origin to the moment when a 1-year-old baby from a fictional Rhode Island suburb needed to get back to his house. The show moved on to the next episode. This is perhaps the most Family Guy thing that has ever happened in Family Guy. The show casually established that one of its characters is the fundamental cause of all existence, and then filed this information under established facts and continued. It became one more thing about Stewie, alongside the British accent and the time machine and the complicated relationship with Lois. But the fan theories that have grown around this canonical fact are interesting less for their speculation and more for what they observe about the implications. Because the fact of Stewie's role in the creation of the universe, taken seriously, radiates outward through the entire show. If Stewie created the universe, then the universe in a meaningful sense was made for the story the show is telling. Every physical constant, every value of every fundamental force, the specific strength of gravity and electromagnetism, and the nuclear forces, all of it has the exact values it has because of the specific way energy was released when Stewie's device overloaded in the void before the beginning. The universe is shaped by that event. It could not have been otherwise. It is calibrated, by its origin, to produce the conditions for a family to live in a house in Rhode Island in 1999, for a show to be created about that family, for a baby in that family to eventually build a time machine and end up outside the space-time continuum and trigger the event that made all of this possible. The universe is, in this reading, a loop. A self-generating, self-sustaining, self-referential loop that exists because the conditions it produces will eventually produce the event that generated it. The temporal causality question at the center of this is genuinely vertiginous. Which came first? The universe that produced Stewie, or Stewie's explosion that produced the universe? The answer is neither. The loop has no first cause. It simply is. Cause and effect fold back on themselves so completely that the distinction between them stops applying. The universe caused Stewie. Stewie caused the universe. These two statements are simultaneously true, and they are not in contradiction because they are parts of the same closed temporal structure. The theories built on this premise take different directions depending on what each theorist finds most interesting. Some argue that Stewie's genius is not coincidental, or even the product of some external intervention like a CIA experiment. They argue that the genius was a requirement built into the universe's own structure. The universe needed to produce a consciousness sophisticated enough to build a time machine and generate the overload that created the universe. It arranged for that consciousness to exist by producing the conditions for it. Stewie did not happen to be smart. The universe could not have existed without him being smart, so it made him smart. The intelligence is not Stewie's achievement, it is the universe's requirement. Others focus on the emotional content of the revelation rather than its cosmological implications. The universe began not with some grand intentional act of creation, but with the utterly ordinary and utterly sincere desire of a small creature to go home. Stewie was not trying to create anything. He was not attempting to leave a legacy or demonstrate his capabilities or accomplish anything beyond returning to the house on Spooner Street, where the people he knew were waiting. And in pursuing that modest and specific goal, he produced something larger than any intentional act could have produced. There is something in that. Something about the relationship between large things and small motivations, between the immensity of what results and the ordinariness of what causes it. The universe did not need a god with cosmic ambitions to bring it into being. It needed a baby who missed his dog. Sit with that for a moment, in the quiet of wherever you are. The universe exists because Stewie Griffin wanted to go home. Everything that has ever happened, and everything that will ever happen, is downstream of that moment in the void when a 1-year-old decided to overload his return pad and get back to his family. All of it, including this moment, right now, as you listen to someone talk about cartoon theories in the dark. Stewie made this possible. The implication of Stewie's cosmological role extends in a direction that the episode itself does not fully pursue, and the fan theories built around it tend to go there with something approaching genuine philosophical vertigo. If Stewie created the universe, then the universe was not created for any of the reasons that various traditions have proposed. Not for the flourishing of conscious life in general, not as an act of love or generosity, not as an experiment in free will or a stage for the working out of moral development across species and eons. The universe was created because a small creature in a yellow shirt needed to get home, and the only available mechanism for getting home involved releasing enough energy to generate the event that made all of space and time possible. The universe, in other words, has a purpose. But the purpose is not grand. The purpose is domestic. 13.8 billion years of cosmic evolution, the formation of galaxies and star systems and planets, the emergence of life, the development of consciousness, the construction of civilization and mathematics and art and theology, and the specific chain of events that produced a Rhode Island suburb and a television show about a fictional family. All of it was downstream of a very specific and very modest desire. The desire to be home. This has an effect on how you read the show's domestic setting. The house on Spooner Street is not just a location. It is the thing the universe was made to contain, the destination, the specific place toward which 13.8 billion years of cosmic development was pointed. Not because it is the most important place in the universe, not because the Griffins are cosmically significant in any traditional sense, but because it is where Stewie needed to be. And the universe arranged itself, from its first moment, to ensure that the place he needed to be existed and that he would be there. The question of free will that this raises is genuinely interesting. If the universe's structure was determined by a single event in a void before the beginning, and if that event was caused by Stewie's decision to overload his return pad, then everything that has happened in the history of the universe was already implicit in that decision. Every event that led to every other event, that led to the conditions that produced the fictional Rhode Island, in which Stewie made the decision that created those conditions. The loop is airtight. There is no gap in it anywhere. Stewie could not have decided differently, because his deciding as he did is the precondition for the universe in which he makes the decision. Some fans have taken this as evidence that Stewie is not, in any meaningful sense, the author of the Big Bang, that he was the instrument through which a self-caused universe generated its own origin, that the universe, in a peculiar sense, decided to exist by arranging for a baby with a time machine to be in the right place at the right moment. The decision that caused everything was embedded in the structure of everything before the structure existed. Others have taken the simpler view, which is that Stewie caused the Big Bang, which is both true and the most extraordinary thing that can be said about any being in the history of fictional cosmology, and that the recursive implications of the causal loop do not diminish the fact but rather amplify it. He made the universe made him. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The contradiction is only apparent. What the theory returns to when it has followed the implications as far as they will go is the act itself, not the cosmological implications, not the recursive loop, just the moment in the void when a 1-year-old decided that home was worth doing something dangerous for, worth the risk, worth whatever the overload might cost. The baby wanted to go home, the universe began. Everything you have ever known, everything you have ever loved, every moment of your specific and irreplaceable life is downstream of that. There is something in that worth lying awake with. Section 8. Family Guy is a TV show. Inside American Dad, the loop that has no exit. The theory in this section occupies unusual territory for fan speculation because it is a theory about the ontological status of the characters rather than their history or psychology or the structure of their world. It asks not who the Griffins are or what happened to them, but what kind of things they are. What is the nature of their existence in the fictional universe they appear to inhabit? The answer the theory provides is this. They are characters in a television show that airs in the living room of the Smith family in Langley Falls, Virginia. The Griffins are not real people in any meaningful sense, even within the fiction. They are the cast of a fictional television program. Their adventures, their struggles, their loves and losses, all of it happens inside the screen of a television set that Stan Smith might turn on after dinner in a fictional suburb in another state. The evidence begins in American Dad. Stan Smith is asked in the course of an episode to name his favorite fictional dog. He does not hesitate. He names Brian. Brian Griffin, from Family Guy. In the world of American Dad, Brian is explicitly and specifically understood to be a fictional character in a fictional television program, not an entity who occupies the same plane of reality as Stan himself. Brian is a character on a show that Stan watches. Stan's world is the primary reality. Brian's world is an entertainment that Stan's world produces and consumes. This single moment is not conclusive on its own. Television shows make cross-references to other shows in ways that are not always intended to carry canonical weight about ontological hierarchy. But this moment is not a casual wink. It is a character statement, asked and answered in context, from a character who is being asked to express a genuine opinion. Stan has a favorite fictional dog. He named him. He names him Brian Griffin. The second significant piece of evidence appears within Family Guy itself, in the season 15 episode Inside Family Guy. This episode takes the form of a behind-the-scenes documentary about the production of the show. It presents the Griffins not as the characters the audience has been watching, but as performers playing those characters. Peter Griffin in this episode is a person who portrays Peter Griffin, who has a life outside the role, who exists as a separate entity from the character he performs. The episode pulls back the curtain on the production apparatus, showing writers and crew and the process by which the show is made. On its own, this reads as the kind of self-referential meta-comedy that Family Guy has always been willing to engage in, the show making jokes about its own fictional status. But when combined with Stan's comment in American Dad, it becomes more specific. If Family Guy is a television show within the American Dad universe, then Inside Family Guy is not just a meta-joke about the fourth wall. It is a documentary set in the production of a show that the inhabitants of the American Dad universe watch for entertainment. It is a real documentary about a real production in the world that contains the Smiths. The Griffins are, in this reading, famous. Famous in the way that television characters are famous. Known by the residents of the American Dad universe. Recognized, discussed, held opinions about. They exist in the cultural landscape of that universe, the way any beloved television family exists in our own cultural landscape. People have feelings about them. Stan Smith has a favorite character. The show has fans. But they are not real in the sense that Stan is real. They are the product of a writing room and a voice cast and an animation studio, all of which exist in the primary fictional reality and produce a show that the primary fictional reality consumes. This creates a structure that is genuinely disorienting when you lay it out in full. The Griffins are fictional characters in a show. That show is watched by the Smiths. The Smiths are fictional characters in a show. That show is watched by you. 3 levels of fiction, each nested inside the next, with the Griffins at the absolute bottom of the stack. They are the most thoroughly fictional of all the fictional people involved. They are fiction within the fiction of television itself. The question the theory generates, and that it cannot fully resolve, is what this means for how we feel about the Griffins. On one hand, it might seem to suggest that we should feel less about them, that they are diminished by being 2 levels of remove from any reader's reality rather than 1. On the other hand, and this is where the theory becomes something worth sitting with, the fact that fictional characters within a fictional universe find the Griffins compelling enough to watch, find them worth caring about, find Brian specifically worth the distinction of favorite fictional dog, suggests that the Griffins have something that transcends the level of reality they inhabit. Stan Smith watches Family Guy. He has opinions about it. He finds it worth watching. Stan Smith is, by any available standard, a more sophisticated fictional entity than the Griffins are. He exists at a higher level of the stack. He has more reality, in relative terms. And still, the Griffins are worth something to him. This is, in its own strange way, exactly how fiction works. The question of whether a character is real has never been the question that matters. The question that matters is whether they mean something. Whether what happens to them means something. Whether the love and the loss and the mistakes and the occasional glimpses of genuine grace that they offer are worth the time it takes to receive them. By that standard, the Griffins qualify. At every level of the stack. Even the most fictional of fictional entities, apparently, can be worth your attention. Can be worth caring about. Can make you want to watch one more episode, stay up a little later, find out what happens next. The layers of this framework have an effect that is worth naming explicitly. When you accept the full structure of it, the Griffins at the bottom and the Smiths 1 level up and you at the top, watching, a strange thing happens to the experience of watching Family Guy. The characters acquire a fragility they did not have before. They become the most nested and the most protected and, paradoxically, the most vulnerable figures in the entire hierarchy. Here is why. Every level of fictional nesting is also a level of removal from the kind of consequence that real things face. The Griffins cannot die in the way that real people die. They cannot suffer lasting consequences in the way that real people suffer them. The world they live in has the properties it has. The reset button, the miraculous survivals, the casual impossibilities, partly because they are characters in a television show, and shows require these properties to sustain themselves across seasons. But also, perhaps, because they are characters in a television show that airs inside another fictional universe, which means that even within the fiction they are protected in a way that the Smiths are not. The Smiths face the consequences of their actions. The Griffins are watched, and watching is a more forgiving relationship than living. But here is the paradox. This same nesting that protects them is also what limits what their experiences can mean. The Griffins cannot mean as much to Stan Smith as Stan means to us, because Stan knows they are fictional. He knows that what happens to Brian is not real in the sense that what happens to Francine is real. He can care about Brian in the way you care about a beloved character. He cannot care about Brian in the way you care about a person. And yet you can care about the Griffins in the way you care about a person. This is the strange alchemy of fiction, the thing that makes it worth spending time with at all. The people who are least real in the hierarchy are the ones who, somehow, produce the most genuine feeling in the people above them on the stack. Stan Smith has a favorite fictional dog. You have had moments, watching this show, when what happened to those characters felt like something real was at stake. When Brian dying felt like a loss. When Peter's rare moments of genuine love felt like a reminder of something you knew about love from your own life. The Griffins are the most fictional entities in the entire structure, and they are the ones who, across generations of audience, have produced the most real feeling. That is not an accident. That is what fiction does when it is working. When it finds the angle that makes the invented thing resonate with something the reader or viewer actually knows. The Griffins, nested inside Stan's television, inside a show, inside our own screens, managed it. At their best, they managed it completely. They were worth caring about. At 2 removes from reality, they were worth caring about. That is, when you think about it, the thing that all of this has been about. Section 9. Quagmire is not human. The incubus theory, and what it explains about the neighbor. No one questions. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most improbable figures in Family Guy, and this improbability is easy to miss because the show presents him with such comfortable familiarity that you stop noticing how little of it actually adds up. He is the funny neighbor. He is Peter's friend. He has his characteristic verbal tick and his recognizable silhouette and his extremely well-documented enthusiasm for the company of others. He is a fixture. Fixtures do not get examined too closely. But when you step back and actually enumerate the specific qualities Quagmire possesses, the accumulation of them starts to suggest something that normal human biology cannot quite account for. And the theory that has grown up around these specific qualities proposes that the reason they do not add up to a normal human is that Quagmire is not one. The theory, drawing on a tradition that extends back through centuries of folklore and demonological writing, proposes that Glenn Quagmire is an incubus. The word itself comes from the Latin incubare, meaning to lie upon, and in its traditional usage referred to a supernatural entity that took human-adjacent form and possessed qualities of attraction and endurance that exceeded anything normal biology would produce. The tradition varied considerably across cultures and time periods, but certain consistent elements persist. An entity that does not age normally, that possesses an effect on others that operates below the level of rational evaluation, that exists in an unusual relationship with disease and physical damage. And that is not quite the thing it appears to be on the surface. Now consider Quagmire specifically. He is stated across various episodes to be considerably older than he appears. His actual age, when the show bothers to establish it, places him significantly past the point at which a person who had lived the kind of life Quagmire has lived would show visible deterioration. He does not show visible deterioration. He looks the same in Season 22 as he did in Season 1. This is not explained by good genetics or attentive health maintenance. Quagmire does not demonstrate attentive health maintenance in any direction. He simply does not age. His relationship with illness is similarly unusual. The show has, across its run, depicted Quagmire acquiring essentially every communicable condition that his particular lifestyle might be expected to produce. These conditions do not appear to affect him in any lasting way. In one episode, notably, he actively weaponizes his medical history in a way that implies not the vulnerability of a victim but the resources of a host. Something that can contain these conditions without being harmed by them, that can direct their effects outward when strategically useful. His effect on other people is the most significant evidence. The show treats this as comic premise, as the running joke of the sexually successful neighbor who never seems to have difficulty attracting company. But when you look at the consistency and totality of this, across every season and every situation and every set of circumstances, normal social mechanics cannot explain it. Normal social success fluctuates. It depends on variables, on mood and context and mutual chemistry and the ordinary randomness of human interaction. Quagmire's record is so consistent and so unaffected by any of these variables that it implies something operating at a different level, or, within the theory's framework, supernatural. The incubus in folklore does not succeed through ordinary means. It succeeds through an effect that operates below the level of conscious evaluation, below the part of a person that makes rational decisions. The success is not earned in the way that human social success is earned. It is simply present, an effect of the entity's nature rather than the product of its efforts. There is a moment in the show that the theory identifies as the clearest evidence for something genuinely unusual about Quagmire. A cutaway gag, played for shock comedy, depicts him in the living room of the Simpson family in a crossover joke. He is discovered by Homer Simpson in a compromising situation. He then kills Homer, then Marge. Then, off-screen, the children. The sound of gunshots, 3 of them. The cutaway ends and the show moves on. But the theory asks you to consider what kind of person eliminates witnesses with that specific completeness and that specific efficiency, and without apparent hesitation or emotional difficulty. This is not the behavior of a human being caught in an embarrassing situation. This is the behavior of an entity whose cover depends on secrecy, and who treats exposure as a threat to be neutralized rather than an embarrassment to be managed socially. An incubus that has been living as a human for an extended period would have developed exactly this kind of response. The cover is more important than any individual who threatens it. The cover always wins. The question this theory generates that it cannot easily answer is what Quagmire is doing in this neighborhood with these specific people over all these years. An incubus does not need human friendship. It does not need the particular, irreplaceable texture of a bar stool and a group of friends who have known you for decades and who you know in return. It does not need to show up when someone needs help, to be genuinely reliable in the way that Quagmire sometimes unexpectedly is. Unless something happened over the decades that changed what it needed. The theory leaves open the possibility that whatever Quagmire was when he arrived on Spooner Street has been modified by what happened there. That the friendship is real even if the nature is not. That the entity that sits at the bar stool every Thursday night is, by now, something different from the thing it started as. Something that has been changed, slowly and without deliberate intent, by the experience of being known by specific people over a long time. That would make him, paradoxically, the character with the most development in the entire show. Not the development that is visible as character growth in the narrative sense. The invisible kind. The kind that happens beneath the surface of what the story shows you. The monster who became the neighbor. The neighbor who became the friend. The friend who, by now, cannot quite remember which of those three things he was supposed to be. The evidence is scattered across many seasons and it accumulates in the way that evidence for something genuinely strange always accumulates. Not in a single dramatic revelation, but in the slow addition of details that individually seem explainable and collectively do not. Consider the specific nature of Quagmire's reputation within the neighborhood. He is known. Not just known in the way that a person who has lived somewhere for a long time is known, but known in a way that has a particular quality to it. People hear his name and respond to it, not always favorably, but the response is immediate and visceral and specific in a way that ordinary reputations do not usually produce. This is the incubus effect from outside the immediate experience of it. The effect that the entity has on the field of a situation, on how people orient toward a space before they have made any conscious evaluation. The folklore traditions that the theory draws on most specifically describe this ambient effect as one of the clearest signs of the entity's nature. You know something is different before you can say what it is. The knowledge is physical, precognitive. The body registers it before the mind can process it. In Quagmire's case, the show has built this into his characterization so thoroughly that it passes as a joke, as a running bit about the neighbor everyone knows about, rather than as what the theory argues it actually is. A depiction of the environmental effect of a non-human entity that has been in one location for a very long time. The folklore also describes the incubus as having a particular relationship with time, not immortality in the dramatic sense, not the explicit inability to die, but a relationship with the aging process that is simply different from the human one. The entity does not decline at the same rate. The erosion that is the universal condition of biological life does not apply in the same way. Quagmire's unchanging appearance across decades of showtime is not just an animation convenience. The theory proposes that it is a characteristic, accurate as far as it can be depicted in a cartoon format, of the kind of being he is. There is a tenderness available in this theory that its more alarming elements can obscure. Whatever Quagmire was when he arrived on Spooner Street, and the theory is agnostic about the specific history of his time before the neighborhood, he has been there for a very long time now. Long enough that the friendship is not a cover or a convenience or a strategic arrangement. Long enough that it is simply the truth. He shows up at the bar on Thursday nights because those are his friends. Not because friendship serves some purpose. Because he has spent more time with these people than with any other set of people in the relevant portion of his existence, and the time has done what time does. It has made them the people he knows. The people whose presence is specific and irreplaceable in the specific way that presence becomes irreplaceable when it has been consistent enough for long enough. Peter is his friend in the way that you can only be someone's friend if they have seen you at your worst and come back anyway. The incubus does not require human friendship, but the incubus who has been living as a human for 40-some fictional years may have acquired the need in the way that you can acquire needs that were not present at the origin. You become what you practice. You need what you have accustomed yourself to needing. Whatever Quagmire was, the practice of living in this neighborhood, among these people, being known by them, and knowing them in return, has made him into something that has those needs genuinely. The origin is what it is. But the creature at the bar on Thursday nights is the product not just of the origin but of all the time since. That is not a small thing. That may in fact be the most significant thing about him. Section 10. Joe Swanson was a hero before the wheelchair. The secret identity theory. This theory has a cleaner shape than most of the others, and a warmth that the more elaborate ones cannot quite match. It takes something the show established for entirely practical production reasons, and builds from it a story that makes Joe Swanson significantly more interesting, and his current life significantly more poignant. Patrick Warburton voices Joe Swanson. He also, in the early 2000s, played the Tick in the live-action Fox television series based on the superhero comic. The Tick aired between 2001 and 2002, overlapping with the period when Family Guy was in its original run. The character Warburton played there is characterized by specific and consistent physical and personality traits. He is enormously muscular. He has a dramatically prominent chin. He is given to intense, earnest declarations about justice and heroism. He is essentially indestructible under ordinary circumstances. He is, at his core, an absolutely genuine and uncomplicated good person who is committed to protecting the innocent with a sincerity that is never quite dismissible, even when it is played for comedy. Now, look at Joe Swanson. Joe has an enormously muscular upper body. He has a dramatically prominent chin. He is given to intense declarations about duty and the importance of doing what is right. His upper body strength, even accounting for the extraordinary compensation that can occur in a person who cannot use their lower body, is superhuman by any realistic standard. He regularly performs feats of physical capability that exceed what should be possible. He is, in his bearing and his commitment, and the specific texture of how he takes his job seriously, exactly the kind of person that the Tick is presented as being. The theory proposed by Reddit user Mr. Dees444 is simply this. Joe Swanson was the Tick, not in a metaphorical sense. In the show's internal logic, Joe Swanson and the Tick are the same person. The superhero identity existed alongside the police career. He was going out at night under a different name, dealing with threats on a scale that exceeded anything a beat cop in a Rhode Island suburb would ordinarily face, using capabilities that the costume or the persona granted him. And then something happened, an encounter that went wrong in a specific way. He came home without the ability to use his legs. The hero career ended. He put the costume away, if not permanently then, at least for now, and moved to Spooner Street, and married Bonnie, and became the neighbor, and the friend, and the father, and the cop that the audience knows. He made an ordinary life out of the pieces that were left after the extraordinary one ended. The wheelchair, within this reading, is not simply the result of an injury, it is the specific and irreversible cost of a particular kind of heroism. Joe got hurt doing something that the people around him will never fully understand, in a context they do not know he operated in, and he has never said anything about it because there is no framework in which to say it. Peter does not know. Quagmire does not know. Cleveland does not know. These are the friends of Joe the neighbor and Joe the cop. They are not equipped for the story of Joe the hero. What makes this version of Joe genuinely affecting, rather than just cool, is what it says about how he has handled the loss of the extraordinary life. He has not been bitter. He has not been diminished, or not more than the circumstances would naturally produce. He showed up for the ordinary things. He became a person his wife could count on, and his children could depend on, and his friends could call at 2 a.m. if something went wrong. He did the quiet, invisible, unremarkable work of being a good man in the ordinary sense, and he did it without telling anyone that he used to be something spectacular. The Tick, in the original comics and adaptations, is defined above all else by his absolute sincerity. He believes in what he does in a way that is total and uncomplicated. He is never ironic about justice. He is never cynical about heroism. He goes out every night and genuinely tries to make things better, not because it is strategic or because there is something in it for him, but because that is the right thing to do and the Tick does the right thing. That sincerity is also Joe's most consistent quality across the entire show. Even at his worst moments, even in the episodes where the show uses him primarily as comic material, there is something underneath it that insists on being taken seriously. A genuine commitment to something. A real belief in the importance of doing what is right. That is the legacy. The superhero years are over. The costume is put away, but the sincerity is still there. It traveled with him from the extraordinary life into the ordinary one, and it is still the most real thing about him. He was something remarkable once. He is something good now. In the long run, the difference between those two things may be smaller than it first appears. The theory, extended further, asks what the hero career cost Joe Swanson on a level that the wheelchair, for all its visibility, does not fully account for. Heroes in the traditional sense, and the Tick represents a particularly pure version of this tradition, operate from a premise that is ultimately unsustainable in the long run. The premise that your own needs, your own safety, your own future, are secondary to the immediate requirement of doing what is right. The Tick, in his television incarnation, is essentially incapable of the calculation that would put his own welfare ahead of someone else's urgent need. The calculation is not available to him. He simply acts. He goes toward the danger. He does the thing. This quality, which is presented as comic in the show and as genuinely admirable underneath the comedy, is the quality that is most evident in Joe Swanson. Beneath everything else, the show layers on top of him. Joe acts. When something needs to be done, Joe does it. The hesitation that afflicts Peter and Brian and most of the other characters does not afflict Joe in the same way. When there is a right thing, he does it. This is not because Joe is presented as wise or morally sophisticated in a complex sense. It is simply that the commitment to doing the right thing is woven into the core of who he is at a level that is below the reach of the ordinary human vacillation about whether and when and how. But here is what that costs. And the show, in its better moments, glimpses this without quite articulating it. The person whose default position is action, whose instinct is always toward doing rather than toward calculating the cost of doing, accumulates damage in a way that the more cautious person does not. Not just physical damage, the damage of having absorbed things, having been present for things, having done what was needed to be done in situations where what was needed was very hard, without the space or the support to process any of it. Joe Swanson is a man carrying a very large amount of things he has never had the space to put down. The wheelchair is the most visible version of this. But the emotional architecture of his later seasons, the brittleness under pressure, the way he responds to things with an intensity that doesn't quite fit the situation, the periods of low affect that the show plays for comedy, but that have a real texture to them, all of this is the interior weight of a person who went toward danger, consistently and without adequate support, for a very long time. The Tick does not have this problem in the live-action show because the Tick is essentially invulnerable in the relevant senses. He does not carry the weight of what he absorbs because his nature does not allow the weight to accumulate in the way it would in an ordinary person. But Joe Swanson is not essentially invulnerable. He is a person, with all the ordinary human capacity for accumulation, who operated as though he were, who went into the situations that the Tick went into, who did what the Tick did, and who came out the other side with a wheelchair and a house in a Rhode Island suburb and 30 years of unexamined weight and a group of friends who love him without knowing quite what they are loving. The Tick would be fine. He always is. Joe is not fine in the ways that the Tick would be fine, but Joe is good. He is specifically and practically and unglamorously good in the way that people are good when they have decided, without drama, to be good and have held to that decision across conditions that tested it. He shows up. He does what needs doing. He cares about the people around him in ways that are visible even when he cannot articulate them. He is the neighbor you would want, the friend you would call, the person you would trust with the things that matter. That is not nothing. After the hero career ended and the costume came off and the extraordinary chapter closed, that is what was left. And it turns out that it is the kind of thing that lasts. Section 11. The water, the neighborhood trauma, and why Spooner Street has always been unusual. Let us move into quieter theoretical territory now. Not to a framework that requires supernatural entities or parallel universes or theological categories. Just to a careful observation about the neighborhood itself, and a question about what could account for the specific density of strangeness that Spooner Street has always concentrated in a very small geographic area. The water theory begins with a simple observation. The inhabitants of Spooner Street are not just unusual in the way that television characters are unusual, heightened for comedic effect, and simplified to their most recognizable qualities. They are unusual in a way that, When you add up the specific qualities across the full population of the neighborhood, suggests something environmental, something in the shared physical context that affects them all in ways that their individual histories do not fully explain. Peter Griffin's intelligence is the most obvious example, but not because Peter is uniquely affected. It is because his variation is the most visible. On certain days, in certain episodes, Peter demonstrates a basic competence and a specific cleverness that his general characterization does not predict. He does something that requires inference or social awareness or even creative problem solving. The next episode, he cannot complete a task that any adult human being, however limited, should find straightforward. The variation is too extreme and too inconsistent to be simply an artifact of inconsistent writing. Or rather, the theory asks whether inconsistent writing might have an in-universe explanation. Something affecting Peter's cognitive function inconsistently, in ways not correlated with any obvious external variable. Something like a water supply with an unstable concentration of whatever is in it. The neighbors exhibit their own patterns. Quagmire's remarkable relationship with the ordinary limitations of human health has already been explored through the incubus theory, but it also fits a contamination framework, as does Joe's emotional volatility, the extreme highs and sudden depths that do not entirely track with the established history of a man dealing with a significant physical disability. Cleveland's specific kind of emotional flatness, which occasionally breaks open into bursts of intensity that feel chemically rather than contextually driven. Even Brian, whose changes the CIA theory explains in one direction, could be explained in another as the product of a substance that affects neurological function inconsistently and over time in ways that do not look like ordinary decline. The version of the theory that does not require deliberate human intervention proposes simple environmental contamination, something in the local water or soil or air, the accumulated product of whatever industrial or commercial history this particular area of fictional Rhode Island carries, has been affecting the residents for years. The cognitive and emotional irregularities visible across the neighborhood are not individual quirks. They are a shared environmental condition manifesting differently in different people, depending on their biology and their existing psychological profiles. The version that includes deliberate intervention is darker and more specific. The contamination was not an accident. Something was introduced into this neighborhood's environment intentionally, and the resulting population of cognitively and emotionally unusual people was either the intended outcome or a studied one. The CIA's presence in the shared universe of Family Guy and American Dad has already been established. An organization willing to implant human brains into goldfish is an organization willing to conduct population-level behavioral studies without the subject's knowledge or consent. The residents of Spooner Street are, in this version, unwitting participants in a long-running experiment. Their behaviors and their outcomes and the specific ways they adapt and deteriorate and occasionally surprise everyone with unexpected resilience are all data points in a study whose parameters they have never been shown. This would explain something about the neighborhood that the show itself occasionally seems to notice without quite confronting. Too much happens there. Too many remarkable things occur in too small a space to too few people. If you lived on Spooner Street in the world of Family Guy, your life would contain more genuinely extraordinary events in a single year than most real people accumulate in a lifetime. And the events would not feel extraordinary to the people experiencing them, because whatever is in the environment also affects the threshold for what registers as remarkable. The neighborhood trauma theory, which is the gentlest version, and the one that requires the fewest assumptions about malicious intent, simply observes this. The people of Spooner Street have been through a great deal. They have experienced things that would, in the real world, require significant time and support to process adequately. They have not had that time, and they have not had that support. The things they have absorbed are still in them. They are changing the people who absorb them, gradually and without any single dramatic rupture, in the way that unprocessed experience changes people. They make you harder. Sometimes, they make you less capable of the warmth you once had access to. They make you meaner at the edges in ways that you do not always notice in yourself because the change was so slow. The neighborhood was warmer in the early seasons. The people in it were more capable of genuine connection with each other. The shift that happened as the seasons went on, the hardening, the loss of the tenderness that once made the show feel like a story about people who loved each other despite everything, is the shift that happens to any community that keeps absorbing things without ever quite dealing with them. The water might be fine. The environment might be perfectly ordinary, but the people are carrying more than they were carrying at the beginning, and you can see it in how they treat each other, in the distance that has grown between them that was not there before. That distance does not require a supernatural explanation. It does not require a CIA operation or a contaminated supply line. It requires only what human experience has always required: time, difficulty, and not enough space to process either. The version of the water theory that takes the deliberate intervention route has an implication that the environmental contamination version does not. If something was put into this neighborhood intentionally, then the results were monitored. The data was collected. The people sitting at the Drunken Clam on Thursday nights, the family in the house on Spooner Street with the television on and the baby doing whatever the baby does, the neighbor in the wheelchair, the figure across the street who is more than what he appears, all of them were being watched. Not casually, systematically. Watched the way you watch an experiment. This adds a layer to every scene in the show. Every moment of genuine connection, and every moment of cruelty, and every moment of inexplicable behavior that the characters themselves cannot account for. All of it was noted somewhere. All of it was added to a data set. The love between Peter and Lois in the early seasons, the specific texture of it, the way it survived things that should have ended it, was a data point. The gradual cooling of that love as the seasons continued, the way warmth became harder to access and cruelty became easier, was a data point too. The rate of change, the shape of the curve, all of it. The Griffins have never had any privacy in this version of the theory. Not because the show is watched by an audience, though it is, but because within their own world they were always already observed. The neighborhood they live in was always already a study. The strangeness of their lives was never random. It was induced, monitored, and recorded. What this makes the Griffins, and this is perhaps the most uncomfortable implication, is something closer to involuntary research subjects than to a family going about their lives. The chaos was not bad luck. It was a treatment condition. The resilience they demonstrated and the limits of that resilience were the data the experiment was designed to generate. They were not living their lives. They were living a study design. And yet, the love was real within it. The moments of genuine grace that broke through the experiment's conditions were real. The thing that makes the neighborhood trauma version of this theory worth sitting with, whatever its origin, is that the human responses it generated were not manufactured. They could not be. The experiment produced the conditions. It could not produce the love. The love came from the people, from whatever they had that the experimental conditions could not reach and could not alter. And it persisted under conditions that were designed to test its limits. That persistence is the thing the theory, in all its versions, points toward without quite reaching. The human capacity to maintain genuine connection under conditions that were designed to make genuine connection difficult, not always successfully, not without cost, not without the accumulation of damage that reduces the warmth and hardens the edges and makes later seasons different from earlier ones in ways that feel like loss because they are loss, but persistently, stubbornly. Not because the conditions permitted it, but because the people in the conditions chose it, in the small and unspectacular ways that people choose things every day. The neighborhood is strange. The people in it are stranger than they should be, but the friendship at the bar on Thursday nights is real. The family at the dinner table, dysfunctional and often unkind and occasionally, briefly, exactly what a family is supposed to be, that is real too. The experiment cannot explain it. Nothing about the study design accounts for it. It is simply there. In the space that the conditions could not reach, in the place that has always been the place that matters, in every neighborhood and every family and every night like this one, where someone is choosing to be present for someone else. Even if only in the sense of listening in the dark to a voice talking about the things they both find worth thinking about. That is real too. Whatever else is in the water. Section 12. The deepest theory, every character, is a fractured piece of one broken mind. We have been moving toward this all night. The theory in this section is related to the one we explored at the very beginning, the Peter fantasy theory, the one that places the entire world of Family Guy inside the constructed interior of a man who has lost everything. That theory is powerful on its own. It explains the world. It explains why the consequences do not stick and why the disasters reset and why the world bends. But this version goes further. It does not just say that Peter invented the world. It says that Peter invented the characters, that every person in the Griffin household is not a separate entity that Peter imagined to populate his fiction, but a piece of Peter himself, externalized and given independent form, because holding all of it together in one place was more than the integrated self could bear. This is a thing that traumatized minds have been described as doing, in therapeutic literature and in literary tradition, and in the accounts of people who have lived through the kinds of experiences that make ordinary psychological architecture insufficient. When the central wound is too large to hold in the integrated self, the self distributes. It takes its different capacities and qualities and fears and desires and places them in separate containers. It relates to those containers as though they were other people. The dissociation serves a protective function. By not having to be all of these things at once, the self avoids the impossible weight of being all of these things at once. Peter's mind, facing what it was facing in the dark room of the care facility, did exactly this. Brian received Peter's intelligence. This is the element the theory is most immediately intuitive about, and the one that the show's own relationship between Peter and Brian most readily supports. Brian is what Peter might have been with different circumstances. He has read the things that Peter wishes he had read. He cares about the things that Peter wishes he could care about. He reaches for intellectual distinction and cultural participation in ways that Peter's surface self never could. Because Peter's surface self is the simple man, the working-class guy who drinks beer and watches television and does not require more from life than the next meal and the next game. But somewhere underneath that surface self, there is a person who wanted more and who got less than he wanted. Brian is where that person lives. The reason Brian fails at everything he attempts is the reason Peter's intellectual potential failed. Not absence of capacity, but absence of opportunity and cultivation, and the specific conditions that allow capacity to develop into achievement. Brian is as smart as Peter's potential allowed him to be, not as smart as he would have been in better conditions. The limitation is baked in, not because the writers ran out of ways to make Brian succeed, but because the fragment contains the same wound the original does. Different container, same damage. Stewie carries Peter's ambition. The conviction, always partially suppressed, that he was capable of more than anyone around him recognized. In the earliest seasons, this ambition is at its rawest. It expresses itself as domination, as the desire to control everything, to ensure that the gap between capability and recognition is bridged by force if it cannot be bridged by anything gentler. This is the ambition of someone who has felt chronically underestimated, pushed past any normal expression by the accumulated frustration of not being seen. In Stewie's most extreme early form, he is Peter's ambition at its most unmodulated. As Stewie's character softens over the seasons, as the grandiose schemes recede, and the emotional depth increases, it mirrors the journey that a repressed ambition might make if given the conditions to find something worth reaching toward that is not domination. Stewie's friendship with Brian, his capacity for genuine love expressed through that friendship, his willingness to sacrifice things for someone he cares about, these are what ambition becomes when it finds a real object. When it stops reaching for power and starts reaching for connection, Lois holds Peter's conscience, the part of him that knows how things should be done even when he persistently fails to do them that way. The moral compass. The thing that says this is wrong and this is right and the people in your care deserve better than what you are giving them? The early Lois, patient and principled and capable of significant generosity, is Peter's conscience when it is still functional. Still capable of doing its work without having exhausted itself entirely. As the seasons continue and Lois becomes harder, more capable of the behaviors that early Lois would have refused, it is the conscience wearing down, getting tired. The conscience that has been trying to do its job without adequate support for too long starts to bend. It starts making allowances it would not once have made. It starts behaving in ways that it would once have identified as wrong and that it no longer has the energy to refuse. The later Lois is not the product of bad writing alone. She is an exhausted moral faculty, one that has been holding the line for so long that the line itself has moved. Joe is Peter's ideal self, the image he carries, quietly and without ever fully articulating it, of what a man is supposed to be. Strong and capable and admired and devoted to the people in his care, doing the right thing even when it costs something, being the kind of father and husband and friend that the people around him can depend on. Joe is Peter's aspiration, made flesh, placed next door so that Peter can have some relationship with that version of himself without being required to claim it. The wheelchair is the limitation Peter builds into even this ideal. Because to allow the ideal to be entirely without limitation would require believing, without qualification, that such a self was genuinely achievable. And Peter has too much history to believe that without reservation. Quagmire is Peter's appetite, the part that wants what it wants without apology or delay or acknowledgement of cost. The part that Peter moderates in his ordinary presentation as the bumbling, consequence-facing main character, but that exists as a genuine force in his psychological interior. Quagmire is what that force looks like if you give it a body and a name and let it operate without the moderation. The relationship between Peter and Quagmire in the show, the way Peter looks at Quagmire's lifestyle with something that is part disapproval and part something harder to name, is the relationship between the moderated self and the unmoderated one. Recognition across a barrier. Cleveland is the part of Peter that tried to be somewhere else. That left, that built something separate in a different context, that discovered that context does not resolve the problems that live inside the person rather than inside the location. Cleveland left and came back knowing more and enjoying less, fitting in differently than he did before. He is the version of change that finds the limits of change, and Meg is Peter's guilt. This is the element of the theory that, once understood, changes every scene she is in for the rest of the show's history. Meg is the consolidation of everything Peter has done wrong. Every unkind action and every moment of carelessness and every failure to protect the people who needed protecting and every promise that was not kept and every standard that fell short. All of it, accumulated across a lifetime of good intentions and poor execution, has been gathered and placed in Meg and required to sit across the dinner table from Peter every day so that the guilt can look him in the eye. The show's cruelty toward Meg is Peter directing his own self-directed shame at an external target. The dissociation that created her also created the distance that allows him to see her as other, as the recipient of contempt rather than the source of it. But the contempt is his. It always has been. He generates it. And every time the show is careless with Meg, every time Peter dismisses her or demeans her or pretends she barely exists, what is actually being expressed is the thing he cannot say to himself directly. The accounting he cannot face. Chris holds the part of Peter that simply is, without the overlay of guilt or intelligence or ambition or conscience. The part that feels things fully and immediately without organizing them into anything sustained or complex. Good-hearted in the way that is a matter of disposition rather than disciplined choice. Confused in the way that comes from not having the self-awareness to identify the confusion. Peter at his most uncomplicated. If every character is a fragment of Peter's mind, then the show's entire arc becomes the story of that mind in various states of integration and disintegration. The early seasons, when the characters still had their warmth and their coherence and their capacity for genuine connection with each other, are the seasons when the fragments were still in relatively close communication. The self was distributed but not severed. The pieces could still find each other. The family could still function as a family because Peter's interior could still function as an interior. The decline is the story of that communication breaking down, the fragments drifting further apart. Brian becoming more insufferable, which is Peter's intelligence becoming more untethered from the emotional groundedness that once balanced it. Peter becoming crueler, which is the integration of the conscious self with the guilt-soaked depths of him failing. Stewie losing his edge, which is the ambition that once knew exactly what it wanted, losing the clarity of that knowledge as the years accumulate. Meg becoming more isolated, which is the guilt becoming more difficult to look at, more walled off, more insistently maintained at a distance. But the moments when something breaks through, and they exist, in every season, even the most maligned ones, are the moments of partial reassembly, the fragments finding their way back to each other across the distances that have grown between them. Brian doing something genuinely kind, Peter showing Meg a real tenderness that neither of them knows how to sustain, Stewie demonstrating a depth of care that the surrounding episodes do not prepare you for. These moments are not inconsistent with the theory. They are the point of it. They are what the exercise is for. Because even the most fragmented version of Peter Griffin's mind remembers what it was built to protect. Not the chaos, not the cutaway gags, not the 30 seasons of accumulated comic machinery, but the love, the family that was real before it became a construction. The people he carries in the only form he has left. He keeps them alive in the only way available to him. And in the moments when the pieces come together, when the fragments briefly align and the love is visible and real and present, and not just ambient, those moments are him, still in there, still trying, still keeping them alive. The question the theory generates that it sits with longest, and that the show itself only occasionally brushes against, is what Peter would need in order to let the fragments come back together. What would make integration possible? Even partial integration? Even temporary? What would need to happen in the room where the real Peter sits for the world inside his mind to become less necessary? The answer is not a dramatic one. It is the kind of answer that actual therapeutic work produces when it produces anything. Not revelation or catharsis or the dramatic confrontation with suppressed truth. Just witness. The experience of being present in the real world to someone who sees you accurately and who does not look away. The fragments in Peter's mind are each doing the work of holding a piece of something too large to hold whole. The integration begins not when the pieces are forced together, but when the person who generated them can, for a moment, be seen. The show provides this, very occasionally, and in the moments when it does, the quality of the scenes changes. Something breaks through the comedic machinery and is briefly, unmistakably present. Peter tells Lois he loves her and means it in a way that is not played for irony. Stewie reaches through his performance and is genuinely afraid. Brian does something selfless that the scene cannot quite account for within the normal character logic. Meg looks at her father with an expression that is not the expression of a punching bag, but of a person who is still, despite everything, waiting. These moments are not accidents. They are what the construct is made of. The love that generated it is still present inside it, preserved and recurring, finding its way to the surface in the gaps between the cutaways and the running gags and the shock humor and all the rest of the apparatus that has accumulated around it over the years. The apparatus cannot entirely suppress what it was built to protect. And what it was built to protect is this: the memory of a family that was real before it became a construction. The memory of Tuesday evenings and specific smells from the kitchen, and the particular way a particular person laughed at something that nobody else found quite as funny. The small inventory of specific things that is what love actually consists of, once you get past the ways we usually talk about it. Peter carries that inventory, in the only way available to him. He keeps it alive in the form of a show that has been running for 25 years. That millions of people have watched and argued about and theorized over and found meaning in and found laughter in and occasionally found themselves moved by in ways they did not expect and could not entirely explain. The inventory is in there, in the house on Spooner Street, in the voices, in the moments when something breaks through the comedy and is briefly, undeniably, real. He keeps them alive, all of them. Every Tuesday and Sunday and Wednesday night, and whatever night it happens to be when you sit down to watch, they are there because he put them there, and because he has not let go. A man in a hospital bed in Rhode Island, eyes open or closed, it hardly matters, holding the world he built with everything he has, keeping the lights on, keeping the kitchen warm, keeping Lois laughing in the other room, keeping them alive. Whatever else you say about Family Guy, in the end, that is what it is. Closing. What the theories leave behind. You have been with this for a while now. The room is quieter than it was when we started. Your breathing has probably slowed. The world outside, whatever version of the world surrounds you tonight, has receded a little, gone soft at the edges the way it does when the mind begins its natural drift towards sleep. We have covered a lot of ground. We started with a man in a hospital bed who built an entire universe out of the materials of grief, who populated it with everyone he had lost and sustained it across decades of imagining, because the alternative was a silence he could not occupy. We moved through the world as an infant sees it, where the adults are giants moving on incomprehensible business, and the logic of things is still assembling itself from the available evidence. We found ourselves in two timelines running in parallel, separated by a cancellation that functioned as a kind of death, producing two different families who share a name and an address but belong to different worlds. We visited a suburb that might be a waiting room between lives, where the suffering is too consistent and too specific to be entirely accidental, where each resident carries a wound that matches exactly the shape of what purgatory is supposed to offer. We learned that the family dog might be a human being in the oldest sense of the phrase, a person placed by design or by accident into the form of an animal, carrying memories of something he cannot quite name. We considered the possibility that a teenage girl contains the key to the origin of everything, that the genealogy of the Griffin family is stranger and more circular than any family tree is supposed to be. We established that a baby in a yellow shirt is the necessary and sufficient cause of the existence of all physical reality, that the Big Bang was the accident that happened when a 1-year-old needed to get home. We went deeper into the layers of fiction, found the Griffins nested inside a television set, inside a fictional suburb, whose inhabitants are themselves nested inside a television set, inside our own living rooms. We sat with the neighbor who may not be the species he presents as, and with the other neighbor who may have been a hero before the neighborhood knew him. We spent time in the specific environmental strangeness of Spooner Street, the way the people there have been shaped by forces that extend beyond ordinary human experience. And finally, we arrived at the theory that gathers all the others into a single frame, that places every character inside the mind of one man and reads every interaction as the conversation he is having with himself, with the different pieces of himself, across the distance that grief and time and the specific architecture of trauma have placed between them. What all of these theories share, the thing that makes them worth the time regardless of whether any of them are true, is that they are acts of attention. They are the product of people who watched something they cared about closely enough to notice the gaps between what the show shows and what it leaves out, and who filled those gaps with stories of their own, with explanation and empathy, and a certain kind of imaginative generosity that takes the raw material of a piece of popular entertainment and builds from it something that feels, in its best moments, like it could be true. This is what people have always done with the stories they love. The versions of the story that they cannot get officially are the ones they construct for themselves. The gaps are not failures. The gaps are invitations. And the theories people build to fill them say something about the theorists that the theories themselves never quite state directly. They say that the story mattered, that sitting with it long enough to notice its gaps and imagine their contents was worth the time. That the people in the story, the fictional people in the animated comedy about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family, were real enough to deserve the kind of careful, tender, elaborately considered attention that we usually reserve for things that are actually real. Peter and Lois and Meg and Chris and Stewie and Brian. The drunken clam on Thursday nights. Quagmire across the street. Whatever he is, Joe in his driveway, Cleveland, wherever Cleveland happened to be, the house on Spooner Street with the television always on and the kitchen always slightly messy and the baby doing something in his bedroom that nobody upstairs quite understands. They were worth it. The attention was worth it. Whatever the show became in its later years, whatever choices were made or not made, whatever creative heart was protected or abandoned, the people who built these theories were paying attention to something they loved. And that impulse is never entirely wrong. The love for a story is its own kind of real. It changes the person who has it. It produces things, theories, and conversations and nights exactly like this one, where someone is listening in the dark to someone else talking about animated characters and finding, somehow, that it is exactly the right thing to hear. The show will keep going. It was renewed through its 30th anniversary. The Griffins will keep having adventures in the house on Spooner Street, whether or not anyone we have discussed tonight is watching. The theories will keep accumulating. New people will watch from the beginning for the first time and notice the same gaps that the original theorists noticed, and some of them will build new explanations, take the available evidence in directions nobody has tried yet, find the angles that are still unexplored in a show that has been running since before most of its current audience was old enough to watch television. That is the part that does not decline. That is the part that cannot be canceled. The imaginative life that a story generates in the people who love it is not subject to network decisions or ratings trends or the creative disengagement of its creator. Once it starts, it keeps going on its own. The theories exist whether or not the show deserves them. The love persists whether or not it is being requited. Family Guy gave people enough to love, at least for long enough, that the love produced something lasting, something that outlives the quality of any particular season and the decisions of any particular writing staff. Something that remains after the show has moved on, and the viewing public has mostly moved on, and the cultural conversation has shifted to other things. The theories, the ideas, the careful, specific, sometimes beautiful explanations for why the world is the way it is, and why the people in it are the way they are, and what they might mean if you held them up to the light at the right angle. That is what you have been spending this time with. Not the show exactly, something the show made possible. Something built by other people in the quiet hours, in the same low-light rooms where you are right now, with the same willingness to let the questions in and see where they led. Wherever they led, it was worth going. Sleep well. The questions will still be here when you wake up. And the answers, the ones that satisfy you, the ones that fit just right, those will be the ones you built yourself. If this helped you unwind, a like and a subscribe means everything to a small channel doing this kind of work. And if you want more nights like this one, there is plenty more where it came from. See you in the next one. One last thing before you go. There is something worth naming about the specific experience of consuming content like this long-form, meandering, concerned with fictional people from a cartoon in the hours before sleep. The mind in the pre-sleep state is not the mind that operates during the day. It is softer at the edges, more permeable. The barriers between categories, between real and fictional, between significant and trivial, between what deserves attention and what does not, have relaxed in a way that the waking mind does not usually permit. In the pre-sleep state, the griffins can matter in the same unguarded way that the people in your own life matter. There is no protective irony available. There is no the distance of this is just a cartoon. There is only the content and whatever it produces in you. This is, depending on your perspective, either a vulnerability to be guarded against or the whole point. The whole point, I think. Or at least the whole point for tonight. The things that find their way through in the pre-sleep hours are the things that were going to matter anyway. The protective layers just get out of the way and let them through without the usual friction. Peter Griffin grieving in the only way he can reach. Brian carrying what he carries without the ability to put it down. Stewie watching the universe he accidentally created going about its 13.8 billion year business while he sits in his high chair. Meg still waiting, still worth more than the waiting. These things find you in the dark, in the hour before sleep, because the hour before sleep is when things that matter are allowed to matter without justification. You do not need to justify caring about fictional people. You do not need a theory that makes them real in some extra sense. They were real enough already, from the beginning, in the sense that matters. They made you feel something. That is all that is ever required. The light is off, or going off. The sound is fading, or going to fade. The breathing has slowed to its overnight rhythm. The mind is releasing its grip on the day and opening its hands. Let it. The griffins will be there when you wake up. They will always be there. 25 years of them, and counting. An endless family in an endless house on an endless street, doing the endless work of being alive together, imperfectly and persistently and against all reasonable expectation, just like everyone else. Sleep well. If this was the right company for tonight, a like and a subscription costs nothing and means everything. And if you find yourself back here at 2 in the morning with another quiet hour to fill, this channel will have something for it. There is one more thing the theories collectively illuminate that is worth saying before the night is fully over, and it is this. The act of theorizing about something is itself a form of fidelity. When you sit with a story long enough to notice what it is not saying, when you care enough about the people in it to ask the questions the text does not answer, when you build something out of the gaps, rather than simply accepting the gaps as the natural limit of what the story can give you, you are doing something that the story itself could not do. You are extending it. You are giving it more life than it was born with. Family Guy, for all the creative decisions that disappointed its most devoted audience, produced something that those decisions cannot revoke. It produced a world that was interesting enough, and characters that were real enough, at least once, that people wanted to know more about them than the show was willing to say. That desire is the most lasting tribute a story can receive. Not awards, not ratings, not the renewal deals and the merchandise and the streaming residuals, the desire to understand. The questions that the text generates and cannot answer, and that the audience carries forward into their own imaginations, building something new from the available materials. The theories we have explored are that something new. They are the audience's contribution to a collaboration that the show did not know it was inviting, but that it invited anyway, simply by being the kind of thing that generates more feeling than it can contain. That overflow is where we have been living tonight. It has been good company. The questions are worth having. The show, for all its faults, is worth the questions it generates. And you, for asking them in the dark, for being here, are part of what keeps the whole thing alive. Good night. See you in the dark. And if nobody else said it tonight, thank you for being someone who finds this kind of thing worth the time. The dark hours, and the long questions, and the willingness to sit with complicated feelings about simple cartoons, that specific combination of qualities is rarer than it looks, And it is the exact combination that makes conversations like this one possible. You know who you are. You have always known. The night is long. The theories are good. You picked the right place to spend this hour and the right questions to spend it with. Rest now.